Welcome back to another episode of Lazy History, where we uncover the brutal truths behind the romanticized tales of medieval times. Today, we're stepping inside the stone halls of medieval courts, but we're not here to talk about kings in their finery or knights in shining armor. No, we're here to talk about the forgotten entertainers who danced on the razor's edge between life and death every single day. The colorful figures whose very existence depended on making tyrants laugh, whose survival hinged on reading the murderous moods of unstable monarchs, and whose lives were often shorter, more terrifying, and infinitely more precarious than anything we can imagine today. So settle in as we explore the dark, twisted, and utterly unforgiving world of surviving as a court jester in medieval times, for those brave enough, or desperate enough, to wear the motley and bells. You've probably seen them in movies, those whimsical characters in pointed hats and colorful costumes, dancing around royal courts, making kings laugh with harmless jokes and silly acrobatic tricks. Hollywood has painted a picture of the medieval jester as a beloved entertainer, a cherished court fixture who lived a life of privilege and protection under the wing of powerful monarchs, immune from the violence and brutality that defined medieval life. But this sanitized, romanticized version of history couldn't be further from the blood-soaked reality that these men and women faced every single moment of their precarious existence. The truth about medieval court jesters is far darker, far more dangerous, and infinitely more compelling than any fairy tale has ever dared to tell. These weren't just entertainers living in some magical bubble of royal protection. They were political pawns, expendable messengers, psychological hostages who lived under constant threat of torture and execution, human beings whose survival depended entirely on the unpredictable whims of kings and nobles who could order their deaths with the same casual indifference they might show when choosing what wine to drink with dinner. The medieval court jester occupied perhaps the most dangerous position in all of European society, simultaneously the most intimate confidant of absolute power and the most vulnerable target for that power's sudden, murderous rage. They were expected to entertain the very people who could have them tortured to death for sport, to make light of situations that could get them burned alive as heretics, and to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics where a single misunderstood joke could result in public execution. To understand the true horror of being a court jester in medieval times, we need to strip away every romantic notion Hollywood has fed us and dive deep into the blood-soaked reality of medieval politics, where wit was both shield and weapon, where entertainment was a matter of life and death, and where the difference between a royal feast and a public execution often came down to whether a king found the joke funny or offensive. Let me tell you the story of Triboulet, one of the most famous court jesters in medieval history, whose life perfectly illustrates just how close to death these entertainers lived every single day. Triboulet served King Francis I of France in the early 16th century, and his story reads like a horror novel disguised as a comedy. Triboulet was known for his razor-sharp wit and his complete inability to know when to stop pushing his luck. He was a natural fool, possibly suffering from microcephaly, a condition that caused his head and brain to be smaller than normal, giving him an appearance that many described as monkey-like. But don't let that fool you into thinking he was harmless. This man's tongue was sharper than any sword, and far more dangerous. One day, expecting applause from the assembled courtiers, Triboulet made what would prove to be the worst decision of his life. He walked up to King Francis I and slapped him on the backside in front of the entire royal court. The king was absolutely furious and immediately ordered Triboulet's execution. But in a moment of what might have been mercy, or perhaps cruel entertainment, Francis offered the jester one chance to save his life. If Triboulet could come up with an apology that was more offensive than the original slap, he would live. Now, most people would have fallen to their knees begging for forgiveness. But Triboulet, with the kind of suicidal wit that defined his entire career, looked the enraged king straight in the eye and said, "I am so sorry, your majesty, that I didn't recognize you. I mistook you for the queen." The entire court went dead silent. In medieval France, insulting the queen was one of the most serious offenses imaginable, far worse than slapping the king. Francis was so furious that he reneged on his offer of mercy and ordered Triboulet's immediate execution. But as a final gesture for the jester's years of faithful service, he allowed Triboulet to choose the manner of his own death. This was it, the moment of truth. Triboulet was seconds away from being dragged to the executioner's block, and he knew it. But instead of begging for his life, instead of choosing some quick, painless death, Triboulet delivered what would become the most famous line in the history of court jesters everywhere. He looked at the king and said, "Good sire, for Saint Nitoc's and Saint Pansad's sake, patrons of insanity, I choose to die from old age." The king found this so clever, so utterly perfect, that instead of having Tribulate executed, he banished him from court. Tribulate had literally talked his way out of death with a single sentence, but his story perfectly illustrates the tightrope that every medieval court jester walked between entertainment and execution. But not every jester was as lucky as Tribulate. For every story of a wit who talked his way out of death, there were dozens more who weren't clever enough, weren't quick enough, or simply pushed their luck one jug too far. The relationship between a medieval court jester and the royal master was unlike any other relationship in human history, a bizarre psychological dance of intimacy and terror that could shift from laughter to murder in the span of a single heartbeat. It was a relationship built on the most dangerous foundation imaginable, the unpredictable moods of absolute monarchs who held the power of life and death over everyone around them. Medieval kings and nobles didn't keep jesters around just for entertainment, though that was certainly part of it. They served a much darker psychological function in the pressure cooker environment of medieval court life. A competent jester could say things to a king that would get any other person immediately tortured to death, but this privilege came with a price that most people today cannot even comprehend. The jester had to possess an almost supernatural ability to read their monarch's mood, to understand the complex web of court politics, to know exactly which nobles were in favor and which ones were plotting rebellion, and to deliver criticism, news, or commentary in such a way that it entertained rather than threatened the royal ego. They had to be part psychologist, part political analyst, part entertainer, and part mind reader, all while maintaining the facade of a harmless fool. But here's where the true danger lay. The jester's protection was entirely dependent on the whims of their master, and medieval monarchs were notoriously unstable. These were men and women who had been raised from birth to believe they were chosen by God to rule over other human beings, who had never been told no in their entire lives, who lived in constant fear of assassination and rebellion, and who were often driven half mad by the isolation and paranoia that came with absolute power. One moment a jester might be sharing intimate jokes with the king, enjoying royal favor and protection. The next moment they might find themselves being dragged to the dungeons for a perceived slight that existed only in the monarch's fevered imagination. The historical record is filled with accounts of jesters who simply vanished overnight, their fates unrecorded, their very existence erased from history as if they had never been born. King Henry, Roman VIII of England, was particularly notorious for his treatment of jesters and entertainers. Henry's court was a place of such psychological terror that even his most trusted advisors lived in constant fear of execution, and jesters were no exception to the king's murderous paranoia. The slightest criticism, the smallest perceived insult, could result in accusations of treason and a trip to the Tower of London, from which very few people ever returned alive. The intimate nature of the jester's relationship with royalty also created countless opportunities for sexual exploitation and abuse. Female jesters, known as joculatrixes, were particularly vulnerable to rape and sexual coercion from their masters and other court officials. Male jesters could face assault from both their masters and other members of the court hierarchy. The jesters' completely dependent status and total lack of legal recourse made them perfect targets for anyone who wanted to abuse their power. The daily reality of medieval court life created an environment of constant surveillance and political intrigue where a single misunderstood gesture, a poorly timed laugh, or even just being in the wrong place at the wrong time could be interpreted as treason and result in immediate execution. Medieval courts weren't just centers of government, they were hotbeds of conspiracy, betrayal, and shifting allegiances where nobles plotted against each other and against their monarchs with stunning frequency. In this environment of constant paranoia and violence, the court jester occupied perhaps the most vulnerable position imaginable. They were privy to royal secrets and intimate court gossip, yet they lacked any real power or protection. They were expected to entertain at private gatherings where state secrets were discussed, to listen to the private complaints and fears of nobles, and to observe the intimate dynamics of royal relationships. All of this information made them incredibly valuable to enemies of the crown and incredibly dangerous to their masters. Jesters were frequently targeted by foreign spies and domestic conspirators who sought to extract information about royal plans, military preparations, or court scandals. The torture and interrogation of captured jesters was not uncommon, as their intimate knowledge of court life made them valuable sources of intelligence. Medieval torture methods were designed specifically to break the human spirit and extract information, and jesters, with their wealth of inside knowledge, were prime targets for these brutal techniques. The rack was one of the most feared torture devices used on jesters and other court personnel suspected of espionage or treason. Victims would be strapped to a rectangular frame and their limbs slowly stretched until their joints dislocated and their ligaments snapped. The Judas cradle was another favorite tool of medieval torturers, a pyramid-shaped device where victims were lowered onto the sharp point, which would slowly tear through their bodies under their own weight. Even if jesters refused to betray their masters, the mere suspicion that they might have been compromised could result in their execution. Medieval rulers lived in constant fear of assassination and betrayal, and during times of political crisis, they often turned on their most trusted servants, convinced that loyalty could be bought and that today's friend could become tomorrow's assassin. The paranoia of medieval monarchs created additional layers of danger for their jesters. Kings and nobles who lived in constant terror of plots against their lives often saw enemies everywhere, and jesters, despite their apparent harmlessness, were not immune to these suspicions. A jester who laughed too loudly at the wrong moment, who seemed to know too much about court politics, or who appeared to be too friendly with the wrong nobles could find themselves accused of treason on the flimsiest of evidence. The legal system offered no protection for jesters accused of crimes. Their word was worth nothing in medieval courts of law, where testimony was weighted according to social status, and a jester's word could never be used to challenge the accusations of a noble. Many jesters disappeared into medieval dungeons never to be seen again, their innocence or guilt never determined, their fates lost to history. Perhaps nowhere was the danger of being a court jester more apparent than in their role as royal messengers, a duty that transformed them from entertainers into unwitting participants in the deadly game of medieval diplomacy. When tensions rose between kingdoms, when wars threatened to break out, when delicate negotiations hung in the balance, it was often the jester who was chosen to carry messages between hostile courts. This wasn't an honor, it was a death sentence disguised as a diplomatic mission. Jesters were considered expendable in ways that proper ambassadors were not. Their deaths would be diplomatically inconsequential, allowing kings to disavow responsibility for failed negotiations while avoiding the political complications that would come from executing a real diplomat. When a jester arrived at a foreign court carrying an unwelcome message, they became the perfect target for the receiving monarch's rage and frustration. If the terms being offered were insulting, if the negotiations broke down, if a king decided to express his displeasure with the proposal, the messenger jester would bear the full brunt of that royal fury. Unlike proper diplomats who enjoyed certain protections under the accepted rules of medieval diplomacy, jesters were fair game for any kind of retaliation. The phrase "don't shoot the messenger" originated in part from this very practice, but medieval kings and nobles rarely honored this principle when the messenger wore the colorful costume of a court jester. To them, a jester wasn't a real person deserving of diplomatic immunity. They were a walking, talking symbol of their master's disrespect, and killing them was often seen as sending a message right back to the king who had sent them. Historical accounts tell of jesters being subjected to the most horrific torture methods medieval minds could devise. They were stretched on the rack to extract information about their master's military plans, burned with hot irons to force them to reveal state secrets, or subjected to the water torture, where victims were forced to drink enormous quantities of water until their stomachs distended and their internal organs were crushed. Others were killed outright as examples to discourage further diplomatic contact, or held hostage to force concessions in ongoing negotiations. Some jesters sent as messengers were never seen again, their fates unknown, their deaths unrecorded, their sacrifice forgotten by the very kings who had sent them to die. But the dangers of carrying messages extended far beyond the destination court. Medieval roads were haunted by bandits, wild animals, and hostile armies, and a lone jester traveling between kingdoms was an easy target for anyone looking to make trouble. They carried no weapons, commanded no guards, and possessed nothing of value except the information in their heads, making them vulnerable to robbery, assault, or murder by anyone they encountered on their journey. Bandits specifically targeted traveling jesters because they knew that the murder of such a person would generate little investigation and no serious pursuit. Sexual predators found easy victims in traveling entertainers who had no family protection and no legal recourse. Many jesters who set out on diplomatic missions simply vanished on the road, their bodies left to rot in forests and ditches, their messages never delivered, their deaths adding to the countless anonymous casualties of medieval political intrigue. The battlefield was another realm where medieval court jesters faced almost certain death, forced to accompany their masters into war not as warriors who could defend themselves, but as entertainment whose job it was to keep morale high even as carnage raged around them. Medieval warfare was brutal beyond anything we can imagine today, a chaotic nightmare of steel and blood where survival often depended more on luck than skill, and jesters were expected to perform their duties even in the midst of this hell on earth. The logic behind bringing jesters to war seemed simple enough on the surface. Armies needed entertainment to maintain morale during long campaigns, and the familiar face of their lord's jester provided a comforting reminder of home and better times. But the reality was far more sinister and far more dangerous than anyone today could comprehend. Jesters were often positioned on the front lines of battle, not to fight, but to mock the enemy, to deliver insults and taunts designed to provoke the opposing army into making tactical mistakes. This made them prime targets for enemy archers, crossbowmen, and anyone else who could reach them with a weapon. Unlike knights who wore heavy armor and carried shields to protect themselves, jesters performed in their traditional colorful costumes, offering no protection whatsoever against arrows, spears, or swords. They were essentially human targets, positioned to draw enemy fire and attention while the real soldiers maneuvered for tactical advantage. Medieval battle tactics often involved using expendable personnel to waste the enemy's ammunition or to reveal their positions, and jesters were considered perfect for this role because their deaths would not weaken the army's actual fighting capacity. The historical record contains numerous accounts of jesters being killed in battle, their deaths recorded not as military casualties worthy of honor, but as incidental losses, no more significant than the death of a pack animal or supply wagon. Some were killed by enemy action, shot down by archers who found their taunts particularly annoying or who simply wanted to silence the noise. Others were killed by their own side in the chaos and confusion of medieval combat, where friend and foe could become indistinguishable in the heat of battle. Even when jesters survived the actual fighting, they faced additional dangers in military camps that were often more brutal than the battlefield itself. Medieval armies were collections of hardened men who had been trained for violence and often brutalized by years of warfare. They lived by different rules than civilian society. Rules where might made right and the strong preyed on the weak with impunity. Sexual assault was a constant threat for jesters in military camps, both male and female. Soldiers would often take out their frustrations, their fear, and their pent-up aggression on the most vulnerable members of the camp, and jesters, lacking the protection of martial brotherhood or noble status, were frequent victims. Theft of their few possessions was common, as was casual violence from soldiers who saw beating a jester as harmless entertainment after a hard day of marching or fighting. The conditions in medieval military camps were appalling by any standard. Sanitation was non-existent, disease ran rampant, and medical care was primitive at best. Jesters who became sick or injured often found themselves abandoned by the army, left to die by the roadside or in whatever hovel they could find. Their lives meant nothing to military commanders focused on winning battles and capturing territory. The story of Musen Bor provides a perfect, if darkly ironic, example of just how dangerous the jester's profession could be, even when they were trying to help. Born Antoni Talander in Barcelona in 1358, Bor would become infamous not for his entertainment skills, but for accidentally killing his own king with what was supposed to be a harmless joke. When King Martin I of Aragon became seriously ill, Bor attended his bedside, fulfilling one of the primary duties of court jesters to provide comfort and entertainment to their masters even in their darkest hours. The king was clearly dying, and everyone in the court knew it. In an attempt to lift the monarch's spirits and perhaps bring him some small measure of joy in his final days, Bor told what he thought was a simple, innocent joke. In the next vineyard, Bor said, "I saw a young deer hanging by his tail from a tree, as if someone had punished him for stealing figs." It was a silly, absurd image, the kind of gentle humor that jesters had been using to entertain nobility for centuries. But the effect on the dying king was anything but gentle. King Martin I began laughing at the joke, and he couldn't stop. He laughed for 3 straight hours, his body racked by uncontrollable spasms of mirth that his weakened condition couldn't handle. Finally, still laughing, the king tumbled from his bed and died on the floor, killed by the very entertainment that was supposed to comfort him in his final days. Bor had accomplished what no enemy army, no assassin, no poison had managed to do. He had killed his own king with a joke. The irony was lost on no one, least of all the court officials who now had to explain to the kingdom how their monarch had died laughing at a story about the deer stealing figs. Bor's fate after this incident is not recorded in the historical sources, but it's safe to assume that being responsible for the death of a king, even accidentally, was not a career-enhancing move for a medieval court jester. This story illustrates one of the most overlooked dangers of being a court jester, the constant possibility that even their most innocent actions could have catastrophic consequences. Jesters were expected to be entertaining, but not too entertaining. They had to be funny, but not so funny that they caused problems. They needed to lift spirits without going too far, to provide comfort without creating chaos. It was an impossible balance to maintain, and the consequences of getting it wrong could be fatal, both for their audience and for themselves. The death of King Martin I also demonstrates how jesters could become scapegoats for events completely beyond their control. When kings died unexpectedly, when military campaigns failed, when diplomatic missions went wrong, it was often convenient to blame the court jester. They were expendable, they had no powerful allies to defend them, and their deaths would satisfy the public need for someone to be held responsible without actually punishing anyone important. The economic reality of being a court jester created yet another layer of danger that made their already precarious existence even more desperate and vulnerable. These entertainers lived entirely at the mercy of their master's financial whims, with no guarantee of payment, shelter, or even basic food, creating a situation where their survival depended not just on avoiding execution, but on maintaining constant royal favor in a system designed to be arbitrary and unpredictable. Unlike other court officials who held established positions with divine duties and regular compensation, jesters existed in a legal and economic gray area where they were considered somewhere between property and pets. Payment for jesters was irregular and entirely subjective, often dependent on how well their performances were received on any given day. A jester who failed to amuse their master might find themselves not only unpaid, but actively punished for their failure to entertain. This economic uncertainty created a vicious cycle of desperation and dependency. Jesters could never plan for the future, could never build any kind of financial security, and could never know if they would have enough to eat from one day to the next. They lived from performance to performance, from royal mood to royal mood, never certain whether their next joke might be their last. The irregular income also meant that jesters had no resources to defend themselves when accusations were made against them. They couldn't afford legal representation, couldn't hire bodyguards to protect them from enemies, and couldn't even flee to other kingdoms when their lives were threatened because they lacked the funds for travel and resettlement. They were trapped by their poverty as completely as they were trapped by their legal status. Some jesters attempted to supplement their income by performing for other nobles or at public gatherings, but this carried enormous risks of its own. A jester caught entertaining potential enemies of their master could be accused of treason, espionage, or disloyalty. Those who performed the same material for different audiences risked being seen as mercenary or untrustworthy. The exclusive nature of court entertainment meant that jesters were often locked into economic relationships that resembled slavery more than employment. The lack of economic security also meant that when jesters lost their positions, they often faced destitution and death. There was no unemployment insurance in medieval times, no social safety net for entertainers who fell out of favor, and former court jesters who were dismissed from their positions often found themselves completely unemployable. Who would hire someone who had been rejected by royalty? What kind of work could someone do whose only skills involved making jokes and performing tricks? Many former jesters ended up as beggars, thieves, or prostitutes, forced to use whatever skills they possessed to survive on the streets of medieval cities that showed no mercy to the poor and desperate. Others simply starved to death, their bodies found in ditches and alleyways, their deaths unmarked and unmourned by a society that had used them up and discarded them like broken toys. The economic desperation also made jesters vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation and abuse. Knowing that these entertainers had nowhere else to go and no other means of survival, unscrupulous nobles and court officials could force them into degrading or dangerous situations with the threat of dismissal hanging over their heads. Sexual exploitation was common, as was forcing jesters to spy on other court members or to participate in illegal activities. The physical dangers that medieval court jesters faced extended far beyond the obvious threats of execution and torture to include the chronic health hazards of court life, where disease, malnutrition, and primitive medical care created a constant threat to survival that claimed more jester lives than all the royal executions combined. Medieval castles and palaces, despite their imposing appearance, were actually death traps for their inhabitants, places where infectious diseases spread like wildfire and where basic sanitation was virtually unknown. Court jesters lived in these disease-ridden environments alongside hundreds of other people, sharing cramped quarters, contaminated water supplies, and facilities that would horrify modern health inspectors. The close quarters and abysmal hygiene created perfect conditions for the spread of deadly illnesses, from tuberculosis and dysentery to the bubonic plague itself. Historical records show that respiratory diseases were extremely common among court staff, caused by poorly ventilated rooms filled with smoke from inadequately designed fireplaces and the complete absence of any understanding of air quality. The jester's lifestyle and duties put them at even greater risk than other court inhabitants. They were required to perform physically demanding routines, including acrobatics, juggling, dancing, and other activities that could result in serious injuries. In an age before modern medicine, antiseptics, or even basic understanding of infection, a broken bone, a torn muscle, or a serious cut could easily become infected and lead to a slow, agonizing death. Jesters who became injured or ill often found themselves abandoned by their masters, who saw no value in maintaining entertainers who could no longer perform. There were no disability benefits, no medical insurance, no social support systems for court personnel who became unable to fulfill their duties. A jester who broke a leg during a performance might find themselves thrown out of the castle to fend for themselves, left to die in whatever hovel they could find. The psychological stress of living under constant threat of death also took a severe toll on jesters' physical health. The human body wasn't designed to live in a state of perpetual terror, and the chronic stress of never knowing whether the next day would bring entertainment or execution manifested in numerous physical symptoms. Heart problems, digestive issues, and nervous disorders were common among court jesters, though medieval medicine had no understanding of the connection between psychological stress and physical illness. Malnutrition was another constant threat that weakened jesters' immune systems and made them more susceptible to disease. Despite living in royal court surrounded by elaborate feasts, jesters often went hungry because their food depended entirely on their master's mood and satisfaction with their performance. A jester who failed to amuse the king might find themselves given nothing but table scraps, or nothing at all, creating a vicious cycle where poor nutrition made it harder to perform well, which led to less food and even worse health. The combination of poor nutrition, constant stress, physical demands, and exposure to disease created a perfect storm of health problems that made the average lifespan of a medieval court jester significantly shorter than even the already brief life expectancy of medieval commoners. Many jesters died not from royal executions or political intrigue, but from simple illnesses that their weakened bodies could not fight off. The psychological toll of being a medieval court jester was perhaps the most cruel and lasting aspect of their existence, a form of mental torture that slowly destroyed the human spirit while demanding that the victim maintain a facade of cheerfulness and wit. The constant pressure to entertain, to read the murderous moods of unstable monarchs, and to navigate the deadly maze of court politics created a unique form of psychological abuse that left permanent scars on anyone who endured it. Jesters were required to be on every moment of every day to maintain their entertaining persona even when they were terrified, sick, heartbroken, or facing imminent death. They couldn't show weakness, couldn't reveal their true feelings, couldn't seek comfort or support from others because any sign of vulnerability might be interpreted as a failure to fulfill their role and result in immediate punishment or dismissal. This constant emotional suppression created a psychological phenomenon that modern psychiatrists would recognize as dissociative identity disorder. Jesters were forced to split themselves into two separate people, their public entertainer persona and their private, terrified human self. Over time, many jesters lost track of which identity was real, becoming trapped in a performance they could never escape. The isolation that came with the jester's position was another source of devastating psychological damage. They existed in a social no-man's land, too close to power to be friends with servants, too low in status to be accepted by nobles, and too dangerous to be trusted by anyone. They were surrounded by people every day but lived in complete emotional isolation, privy to everyone's secrets but unable to share their own fears and burdens with another living soul. The constant exposure to violence, cruelty, and arbitrary death also left deep psychological wounds on jesters who were forced to witness, and sometimes participate in, the brutal realities of medieval justice. They watched public executions, torture sessions, and acts of casual violence that were routine parts of court life, all while being expected to find humor in the darkness and to help their masters laugh off the horrors they had witnessed or personally committed. Many jesters developed what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic anxiety disorders, and clinical depression. They turned to alcohol and other substances to numb their psychological pain, creating additional health problems and making them even more vulnerable to the countless dangers of court life. Some suffered complete psychological breakdowns, losing their ability to perform and therefore their only reason for existing in the medieval world. The cruel irony was that the very skills that kept jesters alive, their wit, their ability to find humor in horrific situations, and their talent for making others laugh, were also the things that prevented them from processing their own trauma and seeking any kind of healing. They were trapped in a role that demanded they sacrifice their mental health for the entertainment of people who would kill them without a second thought, and many paid the ultimate psychological price for this impossible situation. Perhaps most tragically of all, the few jesters who managed to survive long enough to be dismissed from court service often found that they could never readjust to normal life. Years of psychological abuse, constant terror, and forced performance had left them unable to form normal human relationships or to function in regular society. They had been broken so completely by their experiences that freedom itself became just another form of prison. The creation of a medieval court jester began long before they ever set foot in a royal palace, starting with a recruitment process that was equal parts talent scouting and systematic child trafficking. Unlike other medieval professions, where children typically followed in their parents' footsteps, becoming blacksmiths' sons or merchants' daughters, the path to becoming a court jester was far more sinister and involved the deliberate targeting of society's most vulnerable members. Recruiting agents, often former jesters themselves who had survived long enough to retire from active court service, traveled the European countryside like predators hunting for children with a specific combination of physical attributes, intellectual potential, and desperate family circumstances that would make them suitable candidates for transformation into royal entertainers. These recruiters weren't looking for happy, well-adjusted children from stable, loving families who might resist the brutal conditioning process ahead. Instead, they specifically targeted orphans whose parents had died from plague, warfare, or famine, leaving them with no one to protect them from exploitation. They sought out the children of debtors whose families were so financially desperate that selling a child seemed like their only option for survival. Most valuable of all were children born with physical deformities, particularly dwarfs, hunchbacks, and those with facial abnormalities that medieval courts found inherently amusing. The medieval nobility had an insatiable appetite for what they called natural fools, people whose physical appearance was considered entertaining simply by virtue of their deformities. The demand for dwarf jesters was so extraordinarily high that a horrifying practice developed of artificially creating them when natural supply couldn't meet court demand. According to historical documents, some recruiters and trainers would deliberately stunt children's growth through various methods, including the application of toxic substances to developing spines and the systematic malnourishment of growing bodies. Children as young as infants would have their normal development interrupted and their bodies deliberately twisted and malformed, all to create the kind of physical abnormalities that medieval nobles found hilarious. This wasn't folklore or superstition, this was an actual business practice carried out by people who made their living supplying European courts with deformed human beings for entertainment purposes. But physical deformity alone wasn't sufficient for successful jester recruitment. The agents also looked for signs of intelligence, quick wit, and the kind of psychological resilience that might allow a child to survive the years of systematic abuse and conditioning that lay ahead. They tested potential recruits with simple riddles, word games, and improvisation exercises, searching for the crucial spark of creativity and mental agility that could be molded into the razor-sharp wit needed to entertain royalty without getting executed in the process. The recruitment process itself was deliberately designed to be traumatic, intended to begin breaking down whatever family bonds and normal social connections these children might have possessed. Parents who were desperate enough to sell their children to jester recruiters were often forced to sign contracts that permanently severed all legal, financial, and emotional ties between them and their offspring. The children would be told that their families were dead, that they had been abandoned because they were considered freaks and monsters, or that they had been rejected by society for their physical or mental deficiencies. This psychological severing was considered absolutely essential preparation for court life, where future jesters would need to form intense, unhealthy emotional bonds with royal masters who could order their torture and execution at any moment. The recruiters understood through bitter experience that children with strong family connections would be much harder to control, more likely to attempt escape, and far less willing to accept the complete psychological subjugation that successful jester life required. Once children were successfully recruited through purchase, coercion, or outright kidnapping, they would be transported to specialized training facilities, usually located in remote areas where the sounds of systematic abuse wouldn't disturb local populations and where escaped trainees could be easily recaptured. These training schools were run by former court jesters who had survived long enough to retire from active service, men and women who understood exactly what kind of psychological and physical conditioning would be necessary to transform vulnerable children into entertainers capable of surviving in the most dangerous courts of medieval Europe. The training process that transformed captured children into functional court jesters with a carefully orchestrated program of physical brutality, intellectual conditioning, and psychological destruction that would have made modern military boot camps seem like gentle summer camps by comparison. The transformation took place over a period of years, during which every aspect of the child's original personality, family connections, and normal human responses would be systematically destroyed and replaced with carefully constructed entertainment personas designed for survival in environments of constant mortal danger. The physical training component began immediately upon arrival at the jester schools and was conducted with a level of brutality that reflected the life and death stakes of court entertainment. Children were forced to develop the acrobatic skills that would be absolutely essential to their survival as professional entertainers, learning to juggle multiple objects while performing backflips, to execute complex tumbling routines that told stories or mocked political figures, and to maintain perfect balance and coordination even under conditions of extreme physical and emotional stress. But this wasn't gentle instruction or patient teaching, it was military-style drilling with harsh physical punishment for any failure to meet exacting performance standards. Children who couldn't master a backflip within the specified time frame would be beaten with wooden staves until they could perform the movement correctly, even if it meant continuing the beatings for hours or days. Those who dropped juggling balls or failed to maintain rhythm in their dancing would have their meals withheld until their coordination improved to acceptable levels. The training masters who ran these facilities understood through personal experience that in a royal court environment, a single failed performance, a dropped prop, or a mistimed acrobatic move could result in immediate execution. Therefore, they made absolutely certain that their students learned to perform with mechanical perfection even under the most extreme psychological pressure, physical pain, or emotional distress. The intellectual training component was equally demanding and far more comprehensive than the education provided to most medieval nobility. Potential jesters were required to memorize hundreds of jokes, songs, stories, riddles, and satirical poems, building vast mental libraries of entertainment material that could be deployed instantly in any social situation. They learned to read and write in multiple languages, often becoming more literate than the kings and nobles they would eventually serve. More importantly, they studied history, politics, current events, and court gossip with the intensity of intelligence analysts, because their survival would depend on making tiny references, understanding complex political situations, and avoiding topics that might trigger royal rage. They learned the genealogies of noble families, the details of military campaigns, the intricacies of diplomatic relationships, and the personal secrets and scandals that defined court life across medieval Europe. But the most crucial intellectual skill they developed was the art of improvisation, the ability to create witty responses instantly to any situation, no matter how unexpected or dangerous. This required not just intelligence and creativity, but also an almost supernatural ability to read social situations, understand political undercurrents, and predict human behavior with remarkable accuracy. The psychological training component was the most sophisticated and the most damaging aspect of the jester conditioning process. Trainee jesters were taught to read facial expressions, body language, vocal tones, and subtle behavioral cues with the precision of professional interrogators or clinical psychologists. They learned to identify the warning signs of royal rage before it became visible to others, to recognize the subtle signals that indicated when entertainment needed to shift to flattery or distraction, and to detect the precise psychological moment when a joke had gone too far and damage control was needed. This psychological training involved elaborate role-playing exercises, where older students or retired jester instructors would portray unstable monarchs, complete with sudden mood swings, violent outbursts, paranoid accusations, and unpredictable demands for entertainment. Trainees who failed to read these mock royal moods correctly, who missed the warning signs of impending violence, or who continued entertaining when they should have shifted to crisis management, would face physical punishment designed to simulate the consequences of similar failures in actual court settings. These simulation exercises became increasingly complex and psychologically sophisticated as training progressed, incorporating elements of sexual predation, political conspiracy, battlefield trauma, and diplomatic crisis that reflected the full spectrum of dangers that court jesters would face in their professional lives. By the time training was complete, successful students had been conditioned to respond automatically to hundreds of different threat scenarios with appropriate entertainment strategies designed to diffuse tension and redirect dangerous emotions. The underground networks that medieval court jesters developed to share survival information represented one of the most sophisticated intelligence systems in all of medieval Europe, a secret communication network that operated entirely outside official diplomatic channels and helped entertainers stay alive in courts where the average career was measured in months rather than years. These networks were born from absolute necessity, because jesters who attempted to work in isolation, relying only on their training and personal experience, rarely survived more than a few years in the incredibly dangerous environment of royal court entertainment. The Jester Intelligence Network operated through an intricate system of coded messages, secret signs, visual signals, and carefully disguised meetings that allowed crucial survival information to flow between courts across vast geographical distances without detection by the very nobles who employed these entertainers. When jesters traveled between kingdoms as diplomatic messengers, military camp entertainers, or participants in royal marriages and political ceremonies, they carried far more than just official communications or entertainment equipment. They brought detailed intelligence reports about which monarchs were becoming increasingly unstable and dangerous to entertainers, which courts had recently executed jesters and why, which survival techniques had proven most effective in specific political situations, and which topics, jokes, or performance styles had resulted in executions or torture in particular kingdoms. This information was literally a matter of life and death for entertainers entering new court environments, because what was considered hilarious entertainment in one kingdom might be grounds for immediate execution in another. The most valuable intelligence shared through these underground networks was detailed psychological profiles of individual monarchs, nobles, and other powerful court figures who had the authority to order jester executions. These profiles were incredibly comprehensive and included information about personal triggers, psychological weaknesses, sexual preferences, political fears, family relationships, and the specific types of humor or entertainment the different rulers found most appealing or most offensive. For example, the Jester Network might pass along intelligence that a particular king became violently enraged when entertained during his morning meals, but was highly receptive to humor and flattery in the evening hours after consuming sufficient amounts of wine. Or they might warn that a certain queen had recently executed 2 jesters for making jokes about her physical appearance, making any reference to her looks or age completely off limits for any entertainer hoping to survive in her court. The network also shared detailed information about successful psychological manipulation techniques, the specific strategies that had proven most effective for managing dangerous royalty without triggering violent responses. Experienced jesters developed sophisticated understandings of how to redirect royal anger towards safer targets, how to use self-deprecating humor to diffuse tense situations, how to employ strategic flattery to recover from entertainment that had gone too far, and how to recognize the precise moment when continued performance would become suicidal. One of the most important techniques shared through the Jester Network was the art of strategic retreat, knowing exactly when and how to remove themselves from situations that were becoming too dangerous for continued entertainment. Master jesters learned to recognize the subtle warning signs of royal mood shifts that preceded violent outbursts, developing elaborate systems of excuses, distractions, and emergency exits that would allow them to escape potentially fatal situations before they escalated beyond the point of survival. The intelligence network also served as an early warning system for major political changes that could dramatically affect jesters' safety across entire regions. When wars broke out between kingdoms, when major noble alliances shifted, when succession crises threatened to destabilize entire political systems, or when religious or social upheavals changed the cultural landscape, the Jester network often learned about these developments days or even weeks before official diplomatic channels reported them. This advanced intelligence allowed jesters to flee dangerous courts before political situations deteriorated, to adjust their performance styles and entertainment content to accommodate new political realities, and to avoid topics or references that might have become politically dangerous due to changing circumstances. Many jesters owed their survival to warnings received through these underground networks, alerts that allowed them to escape courts just before purges, rebellions, or other violent events that claimed the lives of entertainers who lacked access to advanced intelligence. The specific torture methods that medieval rulers employed against court jesters accused of treason, espionage, or simply falling out of royal favor were deliberately designed to be particularly effective against entertainers whose greatest assets were their intelligence, verbal skills, and physical performance abilities. Medieval torturers understood that jesters required specialized treatment techniques that would be especially devastating to people who had built their entire identities around their ability to manipulate situations through wit, humor, and physical entertainment. The rack remained one of the most commonly used torture devices for interrogating jesters suspected of carrying enemy intelligence or plotting against their masters, but the psychological application was far more sophisticated when used on entertainers than on ordinary prisoners. Victims would be strapped to the rectangular wooden frame with their wrists and ankles bound to ropes attached to mechanical cranks at opposite ends of the device, exactly as with other prisoners, but the torture process was specifically modified to maximize psychological damage to professional performers. As the interrogation progressed and the torturers slowly turned the cranks, stretching the jester's body until joints began to dislocate and ligaments snapped under pressure, the psychological component of the torture became the true weapon. These were people who had built their entire sense of self around their ability to talk their way out of dangerous situations, to use words and wit as shields against violence and death, to manipulate even the most dangerous people through entertainment and humor. Being rendered completely helpless, unable to negotiate or perform their way to safety, often proved more psychologically devastating than the physical agony of having their bodies systematically destroyed. Many jesters broke under torture not from physical pain, but from the complete psychological devastation of discovering that their life skills were utterly useless when faced with methodical, mechanical violence. The Judas cradle presented an even more horrifying fate for captured jesters, representing a form of execution that was designed to be as psychologically terrifying as it was physically agonizing. This pyramid-shaped device was constructed with a sharpened metal point at the top, and victims would be positioned above it and slowly lowered onto the point, their own body weight forcing the metal tip through their pelvis and into their internal organs over a period of hours or even days. The torture was made even more cruel when applied to jesters because torturers would often spend considerable time positioning their victims, adjusting their placement and the device to ensure maximum pain and minimum speed of death. The psychological component was amplified by forcing other court jesters to watch the proceedings, making it clear that this fate awaited anyone suspected of disloyalty, espionage, or insufficient entertainment value. For professional entertainers whose careers depended on physical agility, coordination, and acrobatic performance, the deliberate destruction of their bodies through slow impalement represented not just death, but the complete annihilation of their professional identity and everything they had trained to become. Many jesters who witnessed Judas cradle executions reported lasting psychological trauma that affected their ability to perform for months or years afterward. The boot torture device was specifically favored for use on suspected jester spies because it provided a method of extracting information while simultaneously destroying the physical capabilities that made these entertainers valuable. This family of instruments was designed to systematically crush the bones of the foot and lower leg, creating injuries that would permanently disable victims even if they somehow survived the interrogation process. For jesters, whose professional lives depended entirely on their ability to perform acrobatic routines, execute complex dances, and move with the grace and agility that royal audiences demanded, the deliberate destruction of their feet represented both immediate torture and the complete elimination of their capacity to earn a living. Medieval torturers understood this psychological dimension and would often use heated metal boots that slowly coated the flesh of the victim's feet while simultaneously crushing the bones, or employing mechanical devices that methodically broke every bone from the toes to the ankle joint. The victims would be forced to watch as their feet were systematically destroyed, fully aware that even if they provided the information their torturers wanted and were allowed to live, they would never be able to perform again. For many jesters, this knowledge proved more devastating than the immediate physical pain, because it meant that survival would still result in a form of death, the complete loss of their professional identity and their ability to function in the only world they had ever known. Pain 48, the hard and forceful punishment of progressive crushing, was reserved for jesters who refused to provide information or admit to crimes, representing one of the most psychologically sophisticated torture methods in the medieval arsenal. This technique involved placing victims on their backs and slowly adding heavy stones to their chests, creating gradually increasing pressure that could continue for days or even weeks before finally crushing the victim's ribcage and collapsing their lungs. The psychological cruelty of pain 48 when applied to court jesters was particularly refined and vicious. These were people who had survived their entire careers by being entertaining, by keeping royal audiences amused with constant chatter, witty observations, songs, stories, and verbal performances that demonstrated their intelligence and creativity. The progressive, crushing torture made speech increasingly difficult as the weight on their chests grew heavier, gradually robbing them of the very ability that had defined their existence and kept them alive for years. As the torture progressed and breathing became more labored, jesters would find themselves unable to speak with their usual fluency and wit, their voices becoming weak and strained, their ability to construct clever responses and entertaining commentary slowly disappearing under the crushing weight. For entertainers whose entire sense of self was built around their verbal abilities, this gradual silencing often proved more psychologically devastating than the physical pain of being slowly crushed to death. The psychological manipulation techniques that medieval court jesters developed to survive in the most dangerous royal courts represented sophisticated systems of human behavioral control that combined elements of modern psychology, intelligence, work, and theatrical performance. These weren't random survival tricks or simple entertainment strategies, but carefully developed methods of psychological warfare that had been refined through generations of entertainers who had learned to weaponize their wit, charm, and intelligence in service of staying alive in environments where death was always one joke away. The most fundamental and dangerous technique employed by master jesters was something they privately called mirror dancing, a form of psychological mimicry that involved becoming a perfect emotional reflection of their royal master's mental state while maintaining just enough psychological distance to avoid being consumed or destroyed by the process. This required jesters to study their monarchs with the intensity and dedication of professional intelligence analysts, learning to predict mood changes hours or even days in advance and then adjusting their entire personality, performance style, and emotional presentation to complement whatever psychological state the king or queen was approaching. When a monarch was feeling insecure about military failures or political setbacks, a skilled jester would subtly incorporate jokes and entertainment that made rival kingdoms seem weak and foolish by comparison, reinforcing their master's sense of superiority and strength without directly addressing the source of insecurity. When a royal was struggling with aging, illness, or concerns about physical attractiveness, the jester would craft performances that mocked younger people as inexperienced and foolish, or that celebrated wisdom, experience, and maturity as superior to youth and beauty. The most dangerous and sophisticated technique in a jester's arsenal was what they secretly referred to as truth poison, the practice of delivering genuine criticism, unwelcome information, and honest assessments disguised as harmless entertainment that audiences would accept and even applaud. This required an almost supernatural level of skill in psychological manipulation, because the jester had to make uncomfortable truth so entertaining and apparently harmless that monarchs would laugh at their own failures, acknowledge their own weaknesses, and accept criticism that would result in immediate execution if delivered in any other form. One of the most effective truth poison techniques was the agreement trap, where jesters would enthusiastically and publicly agree with obviously stupid or dangerous royal decisions, but then extend the logic of those decisions to such absurd extremes that inherent problems became impossible to ignore. Rather than directly contradicting the poorly conceived military strategy or foolish domestic policy, which would result in immediate charges of treason, the skilled jester would praise the plan with exaggerated enthusiasm while suggesting such ridiculous extensions and logical conclusions that the monarch would begin to recognize the flaws without feeling directly criticized or challenged. Another crucial psychological technique was scapegoat creation, the practice of redirecting royal anger and frustration towards safer, more appropriate targets when monarchs became enraged about military defeats, political failures, diplomatic setbacks, or personal disappointments. Rather than allowing dangerous royal emotions to build to the point where they might explode in random violence against innocent court members or the jesters themselves, skilled entertainers learned to subtly guide these negative feelings toward enemies, political rivals, or expendable court officials who couldn't retaliate against the entertainer who had manipulated the situation. Master jesters also developed sophisticated techniques for emotional regulation, using their performances to actively manage their royal master's psychological state in ways that kept monarchs functional enough to govern effectively while maintaining them in emotional conditions stable enough to prevent the random executions and violent outbursts that made court life so dangerous for everyone around them. They learned to recognize the early warning signs of royal mental breakdowns, psychological crises, and emotional instability, then developed specific entertainment routines and performance strategies designed to restore mental balance before violence erupted. The technique of selective blindness was another essential survival skill that required jesters to appear completely oblivious to sensitive information that could get them killed, while still remaining informed enough about court politics and royal secrets to avoid potentially fatal mistakes in their entertainment choices. Jesters were inevitably privy to enormous amounts of dangerous intelligence about royal infidelities, political conspiracies, military plans, diplomatic secrets, and personal scandals that could destroy kingdoms if revealed to the wrong people. Learning to demonstrate convincing ignorance about information that could result in execution while simultaneously using the same intelligence to inform their entertainment choices and survival strategies required a delicate psychological balance that many jesters never successfully mastered. Those who appeared to know too much about sensitive topics risked being eliminated as security threats, while those who seemed genuinely ignorant often made fatal mistakes by entertaining about subjects they should have known to avoid. Perhaps the most sophisticated and psychologically demanding technique employed by successful court jesters was loyalty performance, the ability to demonstrate apparently absolute devotion and emotional attachment to royal masters while maintaining enough psychological distance and emotional protection to survive the inevitable betrayals, abandonments, and execution attempts that characterized most jester careers. Jesters had to love their monarchs convincingly enough to maintain their positions and avoid suspicion, but never so genuinely that the predictable betrayals would destroy them psychologically or compromise their ability to continue functioning as entertainers. The network of traveling jester troupes that operated throughout medieval Europe served as far more than simple entertainment companies, functioning as sophisticated intelligence operations, recruitment centers, communication systems, and survival support networks for the most dangerous profession in medieval society. These traveling groups maintained a constant state of movement following seasonal festivals, religious celebrations, royal weddings, military campaigns, and political gatherings where their services might be needed, but their true purpose extended far beyond mere entertainment. What appeared to casual observers as colorful bands of performers moving from town to town were actually elaborate intelligence-gathering operations that collected, analyzed, and disseminated information crucial to justice survival across the entire European continent. As they moved from court to court and kingdom to kingdom, these traveling entertainers gathered detailed intelligence about changing political situations, military preparations, dynastic succession plans, royal mental health, court personnel changes, and diplomatic developments that could dramatically affect the safety and survival prospects of jesters working in established court positions. This intelligence network operated with remarkable sophistication and efficiency, often providing information to isolated court jesters days or weeks before official diplomatic channels reported the same development. The traveling troupe served as an early warning system that helped entertainers in dangerous court positions prepare for changing circumstances, adjust their performance strategies to accommodate new political realities, and sometimes even escape potentially fatal situations before they deteriorated beyond the point of survival. The traveling troupes also functioned as recruitment and training centers for the next generation of court jesters, constantly searching for children who might possess the physical attributes, intellectual potential, and psychological resilience necessary for survival in royal court environments. When they encountered orphan children, abandoned infants, or families so devastated by war, disease, or economic collapse that they were willing to sell their offspring, the troops would evaluate these potential recruits according to the same criteria used by professional jester recruiters. This recruitment process was often disguised as charity work or rescue operations, with the traveling performers presenting themselves as benevolent organizations dedicated to helping disadvantaged children. They would arrive in villages that had been devastated by military campaigns, plague outbreaks, or natural disasters, and offer to care for orphan children who would otherwise face starvation or death. Parents facing complete economic ruin would be told that their children would receive education, training, and opportunities for social advancement that could never be provided by their impoverished families. The reality behind these apparently charitable operations was far more sinister and calculating. Children recruited by traveling jester troops often disappeared forever into a network of training facilities, court positions, and entertainment venues where their original identities, family connections, and personal histories would be systematically erased and replaced with carefully constructed professional personas designed for a royal court service. The traveling troops understood through bitter experience that successful court jesters needed to be completely severed from their past lives, with no emotional attachments, family loyalties, or personal connections that could interfere with their total dedication to survival and service in the royal courts that employed them. Children with strong family bonds or genuine affection for their original communities were considered security risks who might prove unreliable in the extreme stress situations that defined court jester careers. These traveling groups also served as retirement communities and support networks for former court jesters who had survived their dangerous careers but were too physically damaged, psychologically traumatized, or socially isolated to successfully reintegrate into normal medieval society. Jesters who had been dismissed from court service, escaped execution attempts, or simply aged beyond their entertainment value would often join traveling troops, using their accumulated skills and experience to train new recruits while sharing their hard-earned knowledge of survival techniques with the next generation of entertainers. These retired court jesters typically carried the visible and invisible scars of their years in royal service. Many had been tortured, beaten, sexually abused, or psychologically shattered by their experiences in courts where human life was considered completely expendable. Others had developed serious alcohol dependencies, chronic mental illnesses, or permanent physical disabilities that made them unable to function in conventional medieval society where such problems were neither understood nor accommodated. Within the accepting environment of traveling jester troops, these damaged survivors found communities of people who truly understood their experiences and could provide the emotional support and practical assistance necessary for continued survival. They could share their traumatic stories without judgment, discuss their survival techniques and accumulated wisdom about court politics, and contribute their knowledge to the training of younger entertainers who would face similar dangers in their own careers. For many retired jesters, these traveling communities represented the only places in medieval Europe where they could exist without constantly performing, where they could occasionally drop the entertaining personas that had kept them alive for years, and where they could experience something approaching genuine human relationships without the constant fear of betrayal or execution. The underground medical networks that developed to provide care for injured and traumatized court jesters operated in complete secrecy throughout medieval Europe, staffed by disgraced physicians, expelled herbalists, and other medical practitioners who had been banned from official practice but still possessed valuable healing knowledge. These clandestine medical operations were absolutely essential for jester survival, because seeking official medical treatment for injuries sustained in court service could reveal physical weaknesses or disabilities that might result in dismissal or execution. The most common injuries treated by these underground medical practitioners were the inevitable results of the brutal physical demands placed on court entertainers. Broken bones from failed acrobatic performances, torn muscles from excessive physical exertion, dislocated joints from repeated abuse, and head injuries from beatings administered by displeased royalty were routine occupational hazards that required immediate medical attention if jesters hoped to continue performing at the level necessary for survival. But seeking treatment from official court physicians or licensed medical practitioners posed enormous risks for injured jesters. Any visible injury, physical disability, or reduction in performance capability could be interpreted by royal employees as evidence that their entertainer was becoming less valuable, potentially triggering dismissal or even execution if the monarch decided that the damaged jester was no longer worth maintaining. The underground medical network developed specialized techniques for treating jester injuries in ways that would minimize visible evidence of damage and allow entertainers to return to full performance capability as quickly as possible. They created lightweight splints and braces that could be concealed beneath colorful jester costumes, developed pain-numbing compounds and herbal medications that would allow injured performers to continue working despite serious injuries, and perfected surgical techniques that minimized scarring and visible evidence of medical treatment. These clandestine medical practitioners also became experts in treating the psychological casualties of court jester careers, the entertainers who had suffered severe mental breakdowns from the constant stress, trauma, and violence that defined their professional lives. Jesters who developed what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, clinical depression, or complete dissociative episodes where they lost contact with reality required immediate psychological intervention if they hoped to continue functioning in their dangerous positions. The underground medical network had only limited understanding of mental illness by modern standards, but they developed practical treatment approaches that often proved remarkably effective for managing psychological symptoms and restoring basic functionality to traumatized entertainers. They used carefully prepared herbal compounds to manage anxiety and depression, developed meditation and breathing techniques to help jesters control panic attacks and emotional outbursts, and created support group systems where traumatized entertainers could share their experiences with others who truly understood their situation. The network also established and maintained a system of safe houses and hidden recovery facilities where seriously injured or psychologically damaged jesters could heal without being discovered by their royal employers. These secret facilities were typically located in remote monasteries, abandoned buildings, or the homes of sympathetic civilians who understood the dangers that court entertainers faced and were willing to risk their own safety to provide assistance. Recovery in these hidden facilities could require weeks or even months of intensive care, during which time the underground network would construct elaborate cover stories and false documentation to explain the jester's absence from court. They became experts at creating believable reports of diplomatic missions to distant kingdoms, religious pilgrimages to remote shrines, family emergencies requiring extended travel, or other plausible explanations that would satisfy royal curiosity without revealing the true reason for an entertainer's disappearance. The medical practitioners who staffed these underground facilities also served as intelligence analysts and information coordinators, collecting detailed reports from the injured jesters they treated and using this information to identify patterns of royal behavior, court violence, and political developments that could affect entertainer safety. Injured jesters often provided the most accurate and detailed accounts available of court conditions, royal mental health, political tensions, and other factors that determined survival prospects for entertainers in different kingdoms. This medical intelligence was often more reliable and comprehensive than official diplomatic reports because traumatized jesters had witnessed court violence, royal instability, and political intrigue from uniquely intimate perspectives that were unavailable to conventional observers. The underground medical network served as informal intelligence analysis centers, identifying dangerous trends in royal behavior and court politics that could help other jesters avoid similar injuries or psychological trauma. The psychological conditioning process that transformed captured children into functional court jesters involved the systematic destruction of normal human emotional responses and their replacement with carefully constructed survival personas designed for existence in environments of constant mortal threat. This conditioning was so thorough and devastating that many successful jesters permanently lost the ability to function as genuine human beings, becoming psychological constructs optimized for entertainment and survival rather than authentic individuals capable of normal relationships or emotional experiences. The first phase of this conditioning process involved complete and deliberate isolation from all normal human relationships and emotional connections. Children in jester training were systematically prevented from forming emotional bonds with their fellow trainees, their instructors, their caretakers, or any other human beings who might provide emotional support, genuine affection, or psychological stability during the brutal transformation process ahead. Any sign of attachment, genuine friendship, romantic interest, or familial affection was immediately identified and ruthlessly punished, often through the sudden removal or disappearance of the person the child had begun to care about. This created a psychological environment where emotional connection became associated with loss and pain, conditioning children to suppress their natural human need for relationships and preparing them for the profound emotional isolation that would define their careers as court entertainers. This systematic isolation served multiple purposes in the overall conditioning strategy. It made the children completely emotionally dependent on their training instructors for any form of human contact or social interaction, creating psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to ensure total obedience and compliance with even the most brutal training demands. It also prepared them for the devastating emotional isolation they would experience as professional court jesters, where genuine relationships were not just impossible but potentially fatal to anyone who attempted to maintain them. The second phase of conditioning involved the deliberate fragmentation and reconstruction of the child's original personality, systematically destroying their authentic self and replacing it with multiple constructed personas that could be deployed as needed for different entertainment scenarios and survival situations. Children were forced to spend hours every day practicing being completely different people, developing distinct voices, mannerisms, emotional responses, and behavioral patterns for various royal entertainment requirements. This personality fragmentation was considered absolutely essential for survival in court environments where jesters needed to be capable of shifting between radically different roles instantly, depending on their master's psychological state, the political situation, and the specific entertainment demands of any given moment. A successful court jester might need to function as a wise counselor providing thoughtful advice in the morning, transform into a foolish buffoon providing physical comedy at lunch, and become a seductive companion offering intimate entertainment in the evening, all while maintaining enough psychological distance from each role to avoid being consumed or destroyed by the constant performance demands. The conditioning process also included extensive trauma-based training specifically designed to build psychological resilience to violence, abuse, torture, and arbitrary punishment. Children were subjected to random beatings, mock execution ceremonies, simulated torture sessions, and other psychological torture exercises that taught them to maintain their entertaining personas even under conditions of extreme physical pain, emotional terror, and mortal danger. This trauma conditioning served several crucial purposes in preparing children for court jester careers. It systematically desensitized them to violence so they wouldn't be paralyzed by fear or shock when witnessing the brutal realities of court life where public executions, torture sessions, and casual violence were routine entertainment. It taught them to compartmentalize their emotions and psychological responses so that personal suffering, physical pain, and emotional trauma wouldn't interfere with their ability to provide entertainment when no survival depended on it. Most importantly, this trauma-based conditioning prepared children for the very real possibility of their own torture and execution, ensuring that they would be able to maintain their professional personas and continue attempting to entertain their captors even when facing death. Many jesters who survived torture or execution attempts credited their childhood conditioning for giving them the psychological tools necessary to endure extreme suffering while still trying to negotiate for their lives through humor and entertainment. The final and most devastating phase of the conditioning process involved the complete erasure of the child's original identity, family history, and personal connections, replacing them with carefully constructed jester personas that would become their primary mode of existence for the remainder of their lives. This identity destruction was so thorough that many successful jesters completely lost track of who they had been before their training, becoming entirely identified with their constructed entertainment personas. The psychological conditioning was considered successful when children could no longer distinguish between their genuine emotions and their performed ones, when they had become so thoroughly integrated with their jester personas that they could no longer access their original personalities. At this point, they had been transformed into living tools optimized for entertainment and survival, human beings who had been so completely reconstructed that they could function in the impossible environment of medieval court life where normal human responses would result in immediate death. The final transformation ritual that completed the jester's training was known among the practitioners as the last laugh, a psychological ceremony designed to permanently sever any remaining connections to the trainee's previous identity and seal their commitment to their new existence as professional entertainers. This ritual was considered the most crucial milestone in jester development, marking the precise moment when a trained candidate became a fully functional court entertainer ready for deployment to the most dangerous royal environments in medieval Europe. The last laugh ritual began with an elaborate mock execution ceremony, where the trainee would be subjected to a detailed, realistic simulation of their own death, complete with authentic torture devices, professional executioners' tools, and a formal execution ritual that replicated the actual procedures used in medieval courts. The trainee was expected to maintain their entertaining persona throughout the simulated execution, continuing to tell jokes, make amusing facial expressions, and perform entertaining tricks even while experiencing realistic simulations of torture and imminent death. This psychological exercise served multiple essential functions in the final conditioning process. It provided the ultimate test of the trainees' ability to maintain their professional persona under the most extreme stress imaginable, demonstrating that their conditioning had been successful and that they could continue entertaining even when facing actual execution. It systematically desensitized them to the reality of their own mortality, preparing them psychologically for the constant possibility of real execution that would define their careers in royal court service. Most crucially, the mock execution ceremony demonstrated and reinforced the fundamental principle that would govern their entire professional existence, that their identity as entertainers was infinitely more important than their survival as individual human beings. The message was clear and unmistakable. Even when facing death, their primary obligation was to continue providing entertainment, and their personal survival was secondary to their professional function. The second phase of the last laugh ritual involved the formal renunciation ceremony, where the trainee was required to publicly and permanently reject their original identity, explicitly renouncing their birth name, their family connections, their personal history, and any lingering attachment to their previous life. This ceremony typically included the symbolic burning of any remaining possessions, documents, or personal mementos from their past, representing their complete rebirth as creatures of entertainment with no existence or identity outside the professional role. This identity destruction ceremony was considered absolutely essential for successful court service, because jesters with any lingering attachments to their previous lives were viewed as serious security risks who might prove vulnerable to emotional manipulation, blackmail, or conflicting loyalties. Those who retained connections to family members, childhood friends, or personal interests outside their entertainment function were considered fundamentally unreliable and unsuitable for the complete devotion that court jester careers demanded. The final phase of the last laugh ritual was the formal assignment of a new jester identity, complete with a carefully constructed professional name, an elaborate fictional personal history, and a specialized entertainment persona designed specifically for the court or royal environment where the newly graduated entertainer would be deployed. This new identity was meticulously crafted to appeal to the specific preferences, psychological needs, and entertainment traditions of the particular monarch or noble who would employ the jester. A newly christened court jester would then be required to perform their signature entertainment routine for an audience of assembled training staff, retired jesters, and other graduates, demonstrating their complete mastery of the physical skills, psychological manipulation techniques, and survival strategies that would be necessary for their dangerous profession. This final performance served as both graduation ceremony and comprehensive examination, proving that the trainee had successfully internalized all the conditioning, training, and psychological preparation necessary for survival in royal court environments. Those who successfully completed the last laugh ritual and demonstrated satisfactory mastery of their training were declared ready for deployment to active court service, armed with the specialized skills, psychological conditioning, and professional identity necessary to survive in what was widely acknowledged as the most dangerous entertainment profession in all of medieval Europe. They had been systematically transformed from vulnerable children into sophisticated psychological weapons, human beings who had been optimized through years of brutal conditioning for the seemingly impossible task of making absolute monarchs laugh without getting executed for the privilege. But even the most successful graduates of the most comprehensive training programs faced a grim statistical reality that no amount of preparation could entirely overcome. The majority of professional court jesters had active careers measured in years rather than decades, and long-term survival depended not only on perfect training and flawless performance, but also on favorable political conditions, stable royal mental health, and an enormous amount of pure luck that no training program could provide or guarantee. The underground resistance movements that developed among medieval court jesters represented some of the most sophisticated and dangerous political organizations in all of medieval Europe, secret societies dedicated to protecting entertainers from the worst excesses of royal violence while working to undermine the political systems that treated human beings as expendable sources of entertainment. These resistance networks operated in absolute secrecy because discovery would result in mass executions, torture campaigns, and the complete destruction of the underground support systems that many jesters depended on for survival. The jester resistance movement was born from the accumulated rage and desperation of entertainers who had witnessed too much cruelty, survived too many execution attempts, and lost too many friends and colleagues to the arbitrary violence of medieval royal courts. Unlike other medieval resistance movements that were typically organized around religious, political, or economic grievances, the jester underground was united by the shared experience of systematic dehumanization and the common understanding that their lives were considered worthless by the very people they were forced to entertain. The primary function of these resistance networks was providing practical support and protection for individual jesters who found themselves in immediate mortal danger. When entertainers received death threats, faced accusations of treason or espionage, or simply found themselves in court environments that had become too dangerous for continued survival, the underground resistance could provide emergency escape routes, false documentation, safe houses, and new identities that would allow threatened jesters to disappear and resurface in different kingdoms under completely new personas. The resistance networks also worked to document and publicize the worst atrocities committed against court entertainers, creating detailed records of royal crimes that could be used for political leverage or diplomatic pressure when opportunities arose. These underground chroniclers maintained secret archives describing specific instances of torture, execution, and abuse, building comprehensive dossiers on the most dangerous monarchs and nobles that could potentially be used to damage their political reputations or threaten their diplomatic relationships. More ambitiously, some resistance cells work actively to undermine and destabilize the political systems that enabled the systematic abuse of court entertainers. These underground operatives used their unique access to royal courts and intimate knowledge of political secrets to engage in espionage, sabotage, and political manipulation designed to weaken the monarchs who had treated them as expendable entertainment resources. Jester spies would gather sensitive political intelligence and sell it to enemy kingdoms, provide advance warning of military campaigns to opposing forces, or deliberately spread false information designed to disrupt diplomatic relationships and military planning. Others would engage in more direct sabotage, poisoning royal food supplies, sabotaging military equipment, or providing assistance to political rebels and enemy agents who sought to overthrow the kingdoms that had abused them. The most sophisticated resistance operations involved long-term political manipulation campaigns designed to drive dangerous monarchs into madness, political isolation, or military defeat. Master jester operatives would spend years carefully manipulating their royal employers, using their intimate psychological knowledge and entertainment access to gradually undermine royal mental health, encourage poor political decisions, and create the conditions for political upheaval that would ultimately destroy their abuses. These psychological warfare campaigns were incredibly dangerous and required extraordinary skill, patience, and dedication from the jester operatives who conducted them. A single mistake or moment of discovered treachery would result in immediate torture and execution, not just for the individual operative but potentially for entire resistance networks that had taken decades to establish and maintain. The jester resistance movement also worked to establish alternative economic and social systems that could provide former court entertainers with options for survival outside the traditional royal court employment structure. They created networks of sympathetic merchants, craftspeople, and other civilians who were willing to provide employment, shelter, and protection for jesters who had escaped or been dismissed from court service. These alternative support networks were crucial for jester survival because dismissed court entertainers typically found themselves completely unemployable in normal medieval society. Their specialized skills had little application outside royal court environments. Their psychological conditioning made normal relationships and social interactions extremely difficult, and their association with royal courts made them objects of suspicion and fear among ordinary civilians who viewed them as potential spies or agents of royal authority. The resistance networks understood that providing practical alternatives to court employment was essential for breaking the cycle of abuse that trapped entertainers in dangerous royal service. By creating economic opportunities, social support systems, and community networks outside the traditional court structure, the resistance movement offered individual jesters the possibility of genuine freedom from the systematic exploitation and violence that defined their profession. Through secret oral traditions, hidden written records, and underground communication networks that operated across generations, the resistance movement ensured that the true cost of royal entertainment would be remembered by future generations of entertainers, even when official histories were written by the very monarchs who had committed these atrocities. Certain medieval courts became notorious throughout Europe as virtual death sentences for any jester unfortunate enough to be assigned there, earning reputations as entertainment graveyards where the average career lifespan was measured in weeks rather than years. These courts were ruled by monarchs whose psychological instability, sadistic tendencies, and complete disconnection from human empathy made them uniquely dangerous employers for anyone whose survival depended on reading royal moods and providing appropriate entertainment. The court of Henry Roman VIII of England stood out as perhaps the most feared assignment in all of medieval Europe, a place where jesters arrived with hope and left as corpses, if they were fortunate enough to leave at all. Henry's court was characterized by such extreme psychological volatility that even his most trusted advisors lived in constant terror of execution, and jesters, with their intimate access to the king's private moments and their professional obligation to provide commentary on royal behavior, faced dangers that exceeded those of any other court position. Henry Roman VIII's treatment of his jesters reflected his broader approach to human relationships, viewing people as temporary sources of entertainment or utility who could be discarded without consequence when they ceased to provide satisfaction. The king's psychological profile, as reconstructed from court records and contemporary accounts, reveals a monarch who suffered from severe narcissistic personality disorder, explosive rage episodes, and an almost complete inability to tolerate any form of criticism or perceived disrespect. What made Henry's court particularly deadly for jesters was the king's unpredictable interpretation of entertainment as either harmless fun or treasonous insult, with no consistent logic governing his reactions. A joke that delighted him on Monday might result in execution charges on Tuesday, and jesters who had served successfully for months could find themselves dragged to the Tower of London for offences that existed only in the king's increasingly paranoid imagination. The historical record shows that Henry Roman VIII went through jesters at an alarming rate, with most lasting less than 6 months before being executed, dismissed in disgrace, or simply disappearing from court records without explanation. Those who survived longer typically did so by developing such extreme psychological profiles of the king that they could predict his moods days in advance and adjust their performances accordingly. Will Somers, Henry's most famous jester, survived an unprecedented 8 years in royal service by becoming essentially a psychological slave to the king's emotional needs. Somers developed such an intimate understanding of Henry's mental state that he could sense approaching rage episodes before they became visible to others, allowing him to either diffuse the situation through strategic entertainment or simply disappear until the danger passed. But even Somers, with his extraordinary survival skills, lived under constant threat of execution and witnessed the deaths of numerous other entertainers who lacked his psychological insights or simply had the misfortune to encounter the king during particularly dangerous periods. Court records describe instances where Henry ordered the execution of jesters for offences as minor as failing to laugh at the right moment during royal performances or appearing insufficiently enthusiastic about the king's latest wife. The court of Ivan the Terrible of Russia represented another nightmare scenario for medieval entertainers, a place where jesters faced not just the possibility of execution, but elaborate torture sessions designed to extract maximum suffering before death. Ivan's psychological profile makes Henry Roman VIII seem relatively stable by comparison, as the Russian ruler suffered from what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe psychosis combined with sadistic personality disorder and complete paranoid delusion. Ivan's approach to jester management reflected his broader philosophy of governance through terror and his belief that inflicting suffering on others provided him with both entertainment and political control. Unlike other monarchs who might execute jesters quickly when displeased, Ivan preferred to subject them to prolonged torture sessions that could last for days or even weeks, treating their suffering as a form of entertainment that surpassed anything the jesters themselves could provide. The torture methods employed specifically on jesters in Ivan's court included many of the most horrific techniques available to medieval torturers, but applied with particular creativity and psychological sophistication. Ivan understood that jesters were professionals who had built their identities around their ability to entertain others, so he designed torture sessions that specifically destroyed their capacity to perform while forcing them to continue attempting entertainment even as their bodies were systematically destroyed. One particularly notorious case involved a jester named Osip Gvozdev, who made the fatal mistake of performing a satirical song about Ivan's military failures during the Livonian War. Rather than executing Gvozdev immediately, Ivan ordered that the jester be subjected to a torture session that lasted for 3 weeks, during which he was forced to continue performing entertainment routines while being systematically flayed alive. Court records describe how Ivan would attend these extended torture sessions as if they were regular entertainment performances, applauding particularly creative applications of pain and demanding that the victim continue telling jokes and performing tricks even as their skin was being removed. The psychological component of this torture was as devastating as the physical pain, as it forced jesters to confront the complete meaninglessness of their professional skills when faced with methodical sadism. Ivan also developed the practice of forcing other court jesters to watch these extended torture sessions, making it clear that similar fates awaited anyone who failed to provide satisfactory entertainment or who showed insufficient enthusiasm for the Tsar's increasingly deranged demands. This created a court environment where surviving jesters lived in constant terror, knowing that their colleagues were being tortured to death in the castle dungeons and that they could join them at any moment. The few jesters who survived significant period in Ivan's service did so by developing what can only be described as Stockholm Syndrome on a massive scale, becoming so psychologically identified with their torture that they lost all sense of their own humanity. These survivors often became active participants in the torture and execution of other court personnel, using their entertainment skills to make the suffering of others more amusing for Ivan's sadistic pleasure. The court of Caligula, though technically from the Roman period rather than medieval times, established many of the precedents for imperial sadism that would be copied by medieval monarchs across Europe. Caligula's approach to entertaining himself through the systematic destruction of his entertainers became a model that influenced royal behavior for centuries, demonstrating how absolute power combined with mental illness could transform royal courts into elaborate torture chambers. Caligula's treatment of his court entertainers revealed a sophisticated understanding of psychological torture that went far beyond simple physical violence. The emperor developed elaborate games and scenarios designed to give his jesters false hope for survival before crushing that hope in the most psychologically devastating ways possible. He would promise pardons, offer rewards for exceptional performances, and create competitions between entertainers, only to reveal that these were all elaborate setups designed to make their eventual deaths more amusing. One of Caligula's favorite entertainments involved forcing jesters to compete in elaborate performance contests, where the winner would supposedly earn freedom and riches while the losers faced execution. The jesters would perform with desperate intensity, believing that their lives depended on their entertainment skills, only to discover that Caligula had predetermined the outcomes and that all participants would be executed regardless of their performance quality. The emperor also pioneered the use of jester families as leverage for controlling individual entertainers, kidnapping the wives and children of court jesters and threatening to torture them unless the jester provided increasingly extreme and degrading forms of entertainment. This technique proved remarkably effective at breaking the psychological resistance of entertainers who might have been willing to die for their principles but could not bear to watch their loved ones suffer. Medieval chroniclers who studied Caligula's techniques noted that his approach to jester management was systematically copied by later European rulers who admired the emperor's ability to extract maximum entertainment value from human suffering. The specific psychological torture methods developed in Caligula's court became standard practices in the most dangerous medieval courts, creating a tradition of systematic sadism that would persist for centuries. The influence of Caligula's methods can be seen in the court practices of numerous medieval rulers who adopted similar approaches to entertaining themselves through the destruction of their jesters. These monarchs understood that simple execution was insufficient entertainment, and that much greater amusement could be derived from elaborate psychological torture scenarios that gave their victims hope before destroying them. The underground jester resistance networks that developed in response to these systematic atrocities represented some of the most sophisticated and dangerous political organizations in medieval Europe. These secret societies operated across national boundaries and religious divisions, united by the shared experience of systematic dehumanization and the common understanding that their survival depended on collective action rather than individual submission. The resistance movement began in the traveling jester troops that moved between courts and kingdoms, providing natural communication networks for sharing information about dangerous monarchs and effective survival strategies. But as the level of royal violence against entertainers escalated throughout the medieval period, these informal information networks evolved into sophisticated resistance organizations dedicated to protecting jesters from the worst excesses of royal sadism. The primary function of the jester underground was providing emergency escape routes and new identities for entertainers who found themselves in immediate mortal danger. When jesters received death threats, faced accusations of treason, or simply discovered that their royal employers had become too dangerous for continued service, the resistance networks could provide false documentation, safe houses, and transportation that would allow threatened entertainers to disappear and resurface in different kingdoms under completely new identities. These escape operations required enormous resources and sophisticated planning, as they involved moving people across heavily guarded borders while avoiding the extensive spy networks that most medieval monarchs maintained. The resistance movement developed elaborate systems of coded communications, secret routes, and hidden safe houses that allowed them to move endangered jesters across vast distances without detection by royal authorities. The resistance also worked to document and publicize the atrocities committed against court entertainers, maintaining detailed records of royal crimes that could be used for political leverage when opportunities arose. These underground chroniclers kept secret archives describing specific instances of torture, execution, and abuse, building comprehensive case files on the most dangerous monarchs that could potentially be used to damage their political reputations or threaten their diplomatic relationships. More ambitiously, some resistance cells engaged in active sabotage and political subversion designed to weaken the monarchs who had systematically abused entertainers. These operations included espionage activities, where jester agents would gather sensitive political and military intelligence and sell it to enemy kingdoms, deliberate sabotage of royal military equipment and supplies, and the assassination of particularly sadistic nobles who had made themselves targets through their treatment of entertainers. The resistance movement also worked to establish alternative economic systems that could provide former jesters with employment opportunities outside the traditional royal court structure. They created networks of sympathetic merchants, craftspeople, and religious institutions willing to provide jobs and protection for entertainers who had escaped or been dismissed from dangerous court positions. The most ambitious resistance operation in recorded history involved a coordinated uprising planned across multiple European courts in the early 13th century, when jester agents working in the courts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire coordinated a simultaneous rebellion designed to eliminate some of the most sadistic royal employers in medieval Europe. This operation, known to the resistance as the Last Laugh, represented the culmination of decades of planning and the most serious threat that the jester underground ever posed to established royal authority. The plan involved jester agents who had been deliberately placed in key positions within target courts over a period of years, slowly working their way into positions of trust and intimate access to the monarchs marked for elimination. These deep cover operatives maintained their entertainment personas while secretly gathering intelligence, recruiting allies, and preparing for coordinated assassination attempts that would eliminate multiple sadistic rulers simultaneously. The operation was scheduled to begin during the Christmas season of 1203, when most European courts would be celebrating with elaborate feasts and entertainment programs that would provide perfect cover for the assassination teams. The plan called for jester assassins to eliminate their targets during public performances, using their entertainment access to get close enough to deliver poison or concealed weapons before royal guards could intervene. King John of England was the primary target of the English operation, marked for elimination due to his systematic torture and execution of numerous court entertainers over the previous decade. The French operation targeted King Philip Augustus, whose court had become notorious for elaborate execution spectacles involving jesters. The Holy Roman Empire operation focused on Emperor Otto Roman IV, who had developed increasingly creative methods for torturing entertainers who failed to meet his entertainment standards. The resistance operatives had spent months studying the security arrangements, personal habits, and psychological profiles of the targets, developing assassination plans tailored to each monarch's specific vulnerabilities. The English team planned to use poison delivered through a special wine that would be presented as part of a Christmas toast performance. The French operation involved concealed blades hidden in juggling props that could be deployed during an acrobatic routine. The German plan called for an explosion triggered during a fire-breathing demonstration. But the operation was betrayed at the last moment by a jester named Heinrich Sternauer, who had been recruited by the resistance but ultimately decided that the risks of discovery outweighed the potential benefits of success. Heinrich revealed the entire conspiracy to Emperor Otto Roman IV in exchange for a guarantee of personal safety and substantial financial rewards. The exposure of the Last Laugh conspiracy triggered the most massive wave of jester executions in medieval history, as paranoid monarchs across Europe began systematic purges of their entertainment staff. Hundreds of jesters were tortured and executed on suspicion of involvement in the resistance movement, many of whom had no connection to the conspiracy, but were eliminated simply because their continued existence posed potential security risks. The failure of the last laugh effectively ended large-scale jester resistance activities for nearly a century, as the surviving underground networks focused on rebuilding their organizations and developing more subtle approaches to protecting entertainers from royal violence. The betrayal also led to much more sophisticated security procedures within the resistance movement, including elaborate loyalty testing systems designed to prevent future infiltration. Individual jester escape attempts, while less dramatic than organized resistance operations, were far more common and often more successful than coordinated uprising efforts. These solo breakouts required enormous courage and careful planning, as escaped jesters faced not only immediate pursuit by royal authorities, but also the challenge of surviving in medieval society without the protection and resources that court employment provided. The most successful escape attempts typically involved jesters who had maintained secret contacts with the underground resistance networks and could tap into established escape routes and support systems. These escapees would often spend months or even years secretly preparing for their flight, gathering resources, establishing alternative identities, and identifying safe destinations where they could disappear without being traced by royal agents. One of the most famous successful escapes involved a jester known only as Gautier the Laughing, who served in the court of Count Raymond Roman VII of Toulouse during the early 13th century. Gautier had witnessed the systematic torture and execution of 3 other court jesters over a period of 2 years and correctly concluded that his own death was inevitable if he remained in service. Gautier's escape plan involved faking his own death during a performance accident, using stage magic techniques and concealed pig's blood to create the appearance that he had been killed when a juggling routine went wrong. The Count, convinced that his jester had died, ordered the body to be disposed of immediately without examination, allowing Gautier to escape from the burial cot during transport. The escaped jester then spent several weeks hiding in the countryside while his appearance healed from the injuries he had deliberately inflicted on himself to make the fake death convincing. He eventually made contact with a resistance cell operating in the region, who provided him with new identification documents and transportation to a monastery in northern France where he could live under religious protection. Gautier lived for another 37 years under his new identity as Brother Francis, serving as a scribe and illuminator in the monastery while secretly maintaining contact with the jester underground. His detailed written accounts of court conditions and escape techniques became crucial training materials for the resistance movement and helped numerous other jesters plan their own successful flights from dangerous employers. Other successful escape attempts involved jesters who used their diplomatic messenger duties to simply never return from assigned missions, disappearing into foreign kingdoms where their original employers had no jurisdiction. These escapes required careful timing and advanced planning, as the jesters needed to ensure they had sufficient resources and support waiting for them in their destination countries. Less successful escape attempts typically involved jesters who tried to flee without adequate preparation or support from the resistance networks. These solo efforts usually ended in recapture, followed by elaborate public torture sessions designed to discourage other entertainers from attempting similar flights. The medieval communication networks were sophisticated enough that escaped jesters could rarely remain hidden for long without organized assistance. The psychological aftermath of failed escape attempts was often more devastating than immediate execution, as recaptured jesters were typically subjected to extended torture sessions designed to break their spirit completely before allowing them to die. Many jesters who survived failed escape attempts reported that they lost all hope and psychological resilience, becoming completely passive and accepting whatever treatment their captors chose to inflict. The development of underground medical networks specifically dedicated to treating tortured and traumatized jesters represented one of the most sophisticated humanitarian operations in medieval Europe. These secret medical organizations operated entirely outside official medical systems, providing specialized care for injuries and psychological conditions that mainstream medieval medicine couldn't address. The medical specialists who staffed these underground networks were typically physicians, surgeons, and herbalists who had been expelled from official practice for various reasons but retained valuable healing knowledge. Some had been dismissed for treating patients regardless of their ability to pay, others for practicing experimental techniques that violated established medical doctrine, and still others for providing medical care to political enemies of the rulers who controlled official medical licensing. These underground medics developed specialized techniques for treating the specific types of injuries that resulted from jester torture sessions. They became experts in reconstructive surgery for facial damage, bone setting for limbs broken during interrogation, and psychological therapy for entertainers who had been driven to the edge of sanity by prolonged abuse. The most challenging cases involved jesters who had been subjected to torture methods specifically designed to destroy their ability to perform while keeping them alive. Patients who had their vocal cords damaged, their hands crushed, or their faces permanently disfigured required innovative treatment approaches that mainstream medieval medicine couldn't provide. The underground medical network also pioneered the development of psychological treatment methods for trauma victims, creating some of the earliest systematic approaches to treating what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They developed group therapy techniques where traumatized jesters could share their experiences with others who had survived similar ordeals, creating support communities that helped damaged entertainers rebuild their psychological resilience. The medical facilities themselves were typically hidden in remote monasteries, abandoned buildings, or the homes of sympathetic civilians who were willing to risk their own safety to provide sanctuary for tortured entertainers. These secret hospitals operated under constant threat of discovery, as providing medical care to escaped or fugitive jesters was considered an act of treason by most medieval authorities. The underground medics also served as intelligence analysts for the resistance movement, collecting detailed information about torture methods, royal psychological profiles, and court security arrangements from their patients. This medical intelligence often proved more accurate and comprehensive than the information gathered through other resistance activities, as tortured jesters had experienced royal sadism firsthand and could provide unique insights into the psychological motivations of their tormentors. Treatment in these underground facilities could require months or even years of intensive care, during which time the medical staff would also work to help patients develop new identities and survival skills that would allow them to function in society outside the court entertainment system. Many former jesters who survived treatment in these facilities eventually joined the resistance movement themselves, using their experiences to help protect other entertainers from similar fates. The economic networks that supported jester resistance activities represented some of the most sophisticated financial operations in medieval Europe, involving complex systems of international banking, trade relationships, and resource management that operated entirely outside official economic structures. The resistance movement required enormous financial resources to maintain safe houses, fund escape operations, support underground medical facilities, and provide ongoing assistance to jesters who had fled from dangerous court positions. The primary funding sources for resistance activities came from wealthy merchants, progressive religious leaders, and even some nobles who were disgusted by the systematic abuse of entertainers in royal courts. These supporters understood that the treatment of jesters reflected broader patterns of royal tyranny and arbitrary violence that threatened all levels of medieval society, making support for the resistance movement a form of insurance against future royal oppression. The resistance also generated significant income through intelligence activities, selling information gathered by jester agents to foreign governments, military commanders, and political rivals of the monarchs who employed these entertainers. Jesters had unique access to royal secrets, military plans, and diplomatic information that was extremely valuable to anyone seeking advantages in the complex political landscape of medieval Europe. Some resistance cells engaged in more direct forms of economic warfare, systematically disrupting the financial operations of courts known for abusing entertainers. These activities included sabotaging trade routes, spreading false information that damaged royal credit relationships, and coordinating boycotts of goods produced in kingdoms with particularly sadistic rulers. The resistance movement also developed alternative employment systems that provided economic opportunities for former court jesters who could no longer work in royal entertainment. These networks included traveling merchant companies, craft guilds, religious institutions, and even military organizations that were willing to employ former entertainers in non-performing roles. The international scope of these economic networks allowed the resistance movement to move resources and people across national boundaries with remarkable efficiency. A jester escaping from a dangerous court in England might receive financial support from merchants in France, medical treatment in a monastery in Germany, and eventual employment with a trading company based in Italy. The resistance also maintained sophisticated record-keeping systems that tracked the movement of resources, people, and information across their networks. These records were kept in coded formats and hidden in multiple locations to prevent discovery by royal authorities, but they allowed the movement to coordinate complex operations involving dozens of cells across multiple kingdoms. The economic power of the resistance networks eventually became significant enough to influence legitimate political and economic developments, as the movement's financial resources allowed them to support preferred candidates for political office, influence trade policies, and even affect military outcomes by providing or withholding financial support for various factions. This economic influence represented one of the most successful aspects of the resistance movement, as it provided them with political leverage that complemented their direct protection activities. The cultural and social impact of Jester resistance activities extended far beyond the immediate protection of individual entertainers, helping to establish new concepts of human rights, worker protection, and resistance to arbitrary authority that would influence European political development for centuries. The resistance movement's emphasis on protecting vulnerable workers from employer abuse created some of the earliest precedents for labor organization and worker protection that would eventually evolve into modern labor rights movements. The resistance also played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge that would otherwise have been lost when courts systematically executed their entertainers. Jester agents secretly recorded jokes, stories, songs, and performance techniques that were unique to specific courts and regions, creating cultural archives that preserve medieval entertainment traditions that official court records never documented. These cultural preservation efforts became particularly important during periods of political upheaval when entire court systems were destroyed and their entertainment traditions lost forever. The resistance movement's archives often contain the only surviving records of regional humor styles, political satire techniques, and performance innovations that had been developed by jesters who were subsequently executed. The resistance movement also contributed to the development of underground communication systems and secret societies that would influence later political and social movements throughout European history. The organizational techniques, security procedures, and networking methods developed by Jester resistance cells were adopted and adapted by other underground movements, including religious dissidents, political rebels, and social reformers. The psychological support systems developed by the resistance for treating traumatized jesters contributed to early developments in understanding mental health and trauma therapy. The group therapy techniques, peer support networks, and trauma treatment methods pioneered by underground medical practitioners represented significant advances in psychological care that were centuries ahead of mainstream medieval medicine. The resistance movement's emphasis on documentation and historical record-keeping also contributed to more accurate historical understanding of medieval court life and royal behavior. The detailed records maintained by resistance chroniclers provide modern historians with information about court conditions, royal psychological profiles, and social dynamics that were never recorded in official court documents. The international scope of the resistance networks contributed to improved communication and cultural exchange between different regions of medieval Europe. The movement's need to coordinate activities across national boundaries led to the development of more sophisticated international communication systems and cultural translation techniques that facilitated broader European integration. The ultimate legacy of medieval Jester resistance movements lies not in their immediate success or failure, but in their contribution to the gradual development of concepts that would eventually evolve into modern human rights principles and worker protection systems. The resistance movement's fundamental premise that no employer, regardless of their political power or social status, had the right to torture, abuse, or arbitrarily execute their workers represented a revolutionary challenge to medieval concepts of absolute authority. The detailed documentation of royal atrocities maintained by resistance chroniclers eventually contributed to changing European attitudes toward absolute monarchy and arbitrary royal power. While these records were kept secret during the medieval period, they were eventually discovered and published during later centuries when political conditions allowed for a more open criticism of royal authority. The organizational models developed by Jester resistance networks provided templates for later underground movements throughout European history. The security procedures, communication systems, and resource management techniques pioneered by the Jester underground were adapted and used by religious dissidents during the Reformation, political revolutionaries during various independence movements, and social reformers during the development of modern labor organizations. The resistance movement's emphasis on international cooperation and mutual aid across national boundaries contributed to the eventual development of modern concepts of international human rights and cross-border humanitarian assistance. The idea that people had obligations to protect vulnerable individuals regardless of nationality or political affiliation represented a significant departure from medieval concepts of loyalty and political obligation. The psychological care and support systems developed by the resistance movement for treating traumatized jesters contributed to the eventual development of modern trauma therapy and mental health treatment approaches. The understanding that systematic abuse could cause lasting psychological damage and that recovery required specialized treatment and ongoing support represented significant advances in psychological understanding that were far ahead of mainstream medieval medicine. The resistance movement's cultural preservation efforts ensured that medieval entertainment traditions, humor styles, and performance techniques survived even when the courts that created them were destroyed. This cultural continuity contributed to the eventual development of modern theater, comedy, and performance art traditions that can trace their origins back to medieval jester techniques preserved by the underground networks. Perhaps most importantly, the jester resistance movement demonstrated that systematic oppression and abuse could be effectively challenged through organized collective action, even when the perpetrators held absolute political power. This lesson would prove invaluable for later generations of activists, reformers, and revolutionaries who faced similar challenges in their efforts to protect vulnerable populations from systematic abuse. The courage, ingenuity, and dedication demonstrated by medieval jester resistance fighters provided inspiration and practical guidance for countless later movements dedicated to protecting human dignity and challenging arbitrary authority. Their legacy reminds us that even in the darkest periods of human history, there have always been individuals willing to risk everything to protect others from systematic cruelty and dehumanization. The medieval court jester resistance movement ultimately represented one of humanity's earliest organized efforts to establish the principle that every person, regardless of their social status or profession, possessed inherent dignity that could not be legitimately violated even by the most powerful authorities. This principle would eventually evolve into modern concepts of universal human rights, but its roots can be traced back to the brave entertainers who refused to accept systematic abuse as the inevitable price of survival in medieval society. The gradual decline of the medieval court jester profession began in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, not through any sudden revelation about human dignity or royal conscience, but through the cold calculation of political necessity and the evolution of royal power structures that made the traditional jester role both obsolete and dangerous to the monarchs themselves. The very skills that had made jesters valuable to medieval rulers, their intimate access to royal psychology and their ability to influence public opinion through entertainment, eventually became threats that Renaissance and early modern monarchs could no longer afford to tolerate. The Protestant Reformation fundamentally changed the political landscape of Europe, creating an environment where any form of criticism or mockery directed at established authority could be interpreted as support for religious or political revolution. Kings who had previously tolerated jester criticism as harmless entertainment began to view their court entertainers as potential security threats whose wit and influence could be turned against royal authority by enemy agents or revolutionary movements. The religious upheavals that swept across Europe made monarchs increasingly paranoid about any form of dissent, even when disguised as entertainment. The rise of professional theatre companies and organized entertainment industries also contributed significantly to the decline of the traditional court jester role. As European cities developed more sophisticated cultural institutions, including permanent theatre companies, opera houses, and public entertainment venues, the exclusive court entertainment provided by individual jesters seemed increasingly primitive and unnecessary. Monarchs could now patronize professional entertainers who performed for broader audiences while maintaining greater distance from the royal household and its political secrets. The development of more sophisticated royal court protocols during the Renaissance also made the traditional jester role increasingly incompatible with emerging concepts of royal dignity and political authority. The intimate, informal relationship between jester and monarch that had characterized medieval courts became seen as inappropriate and potentially damaging to royal prestige in an era when European rulers were competing for international recognition and diplomatic respect. The new emphasis on royal grandeur and ceremonial distance made the jester's traditional access to intimate royal moments seem undignified and politically dangerous. Charles Roman II of England's decision not to reinstate the traditional court jester position following the Restoration in 1660 marked the effective end of the medieval jester tradition in one of its most important strongholds. This decision reflected broader changes in European political culture that valued stability, predictability, and controlled information flow over the chaotic, unpredictable dynamic that had characterized medieval jester-monarch relationships. Oliver Cromwell had eliminated the post during the English Civil War, and when the monarchy was restored, The new political climate no longer supported such intimate and potentially subversive court relationships. By the early 18th century, court jesters had disappeared from most European royal courts, surviving only in a few isolated locations where traditional court culture persisted longer than elsewhere. The last official court jesters in Europe were recorded in Russia, Spain, and Germany, with some noble families maintaining domestic jesters for another century beyond the elimination of the royal court tradition. The Queen Mother's family, the Bowes-Lyons, was reportedly the last Scottish family to maintain a full-time jester, demonstrating how thoroughly the profession had disappeared from European court life. Even these final holdouts eventually abandoned the practice as European society completed its transition from medieval to modern political structures. The transformation of European entertainment culture during this period reflected broader social and political changes that made the medieval jester role obsolete. The development of newspapers, pamphlets, and other forms of mass communication provided new outlets for political commentary and social criticism that didn't require the intimate court access that had characterized jester entertainment. The emergence of coffeehouses, salons, and other public spaces for intellectual discourse created alternative venues for the kind of witty social commentary that had been the jester's specialty. But the disappearance of traditional court jesters did not mean the end of the underground networks of resistance movements that had developed to protect them. These organizations, having spent centuries developing sophisticated systems for protecting vulnerable workers from systematic abuse, evolved to address new forms of exploitation and oppression that emerged as European society transitioned from medieval to early modern political structures. The skills, organizational methods, and moral principles developed through centuries of jester protection work would prove invaluable for addressing new forms of systematic oppression that emerged in the changing political landscape. The transformation of jester resistance networks into broader human rights organizations represents one of the most significant but largely unrecognized contributions to the development of modern concepts of worker protection and human dignity. The organizational skills, security procedures, and international coordination capabilities developed by medieval jester resistance movements provided crucial foundations for later social reform movements that would eventually evolve into modern labor unions, human rights organizations, and international humanitarian institutions. The Jester Underground's emphasis on documenting systematic abuse and maintaining detailed records of official crimes became a foundational model for later human rights organizations that would use similar documentation strategies to expose and challenge government oppression throughout European history. The meticulous record-keeping systems developed by resistance chroniclers, including their innovative use of coded communications and hidden archives, provided practical guidance for later movements that faced similar challenges in documenting atrocities while avoiding detection by hostile authorities. These documentation techniques would prove crucial for later human rights movements working to expose systematic abuse and hold powerful actors accountable for their crimes. The resistance movement's pioneering work in creating international support networks that transcended national boundaries and political allegiances established important precedents for cross-border humanitarian cooperation that would influence the eventual development of international human rights law and modern humanitarian assistance organizations. The movement's fundamental principle that people had moral obligations to protect vulnerable individuals regardless of nationality, religion, or political affiliation represented a revolutionary departure from medieval concepts of loyalty and political obligation. This international solidarity would become a cornerstone of modern human rights advocacy and international humanitarian assistance efforts. The psychological support systems developed by the Jester resistance for treating trauma victims evolved into some of the earliest systematic approaches to mental health care and victim assistance programs that would influence modern therapeutic practices. The group therapy techniques, peer support networks, and trauma treatment methods pioneered by underground medical practitioners were eventually adopted and refined by later humanitarian organizations dealing with war victims, political refugees, and other traumatized populations throughout European and world history. These early approaches to trauma therapy represented significant advances in understanding human psychology and the effects of systematic abuse on mental health. The resistance movement's underground economic networks, which had developed sophisticated systems for moving resources across international boundaries while avoiding official detection, provided practical models for later organizations working to support political refugees, religious dissidents, and other groups fleeing persecution. These economic support systems demonstrated that substantial humanitarian operations could be maintained even under hostile political conditions, encouraging later movements to undertake similar activities and establishing precedents for modern refugee assistance and international humanitarian aid programs. The Gesture resistance movement's core emphasis on protecting worker dignity and challenging employer abuse contributed directly to the development of early labor organization principles that would eventually evolve into modern labor rights movements. The fundamental premise that no employer, regardless of their power or status, had the right to torture, abuse, or arbitrarily execute their workers represented a revolutionary challenge to traditional concepts of employment relationships that would influence centuries of subsequent labor rights advocacy. This principle would become central to modern labor law and worker protection systems worldwide. The resistance networks also pioneered the use of alternative identity systems and underground transportation routes that would be adopted and refined by later organizations working to protect political dissidents, religious minorities, and other persecuted groups throughout European history. The false documentation systems, safe house networks, and escape route coordination developed by the Gesture Underground provided practical templates for later humanitarian operations, including the Underground Railroad and American resistance networks during World War I and II. These techniques for protecting vulnerable individuals while they moved to safety would become standard approaches for humanitarian organizations worldwide. The cultural preservation efforts undertaken by Gesture resistance movements had profound long-term impacts on European intellectual and artistic development, ensuring the survival of folk traditions, entertainment techniques, and social commentary methods that would otherwise have been lost when courts systematically executed their entertainers. The secret archives maintained by resistance chroniclers contain some of the most detailed and accurate records of medieval popular culture, humor styles, and performance traditions that survived the transition to early modern European society. Without these preservation efforts, entire traditions of medieval entertainment and social commentary would have been lost forever. These cultural preservation activities became particularly crucial during periods of religious and political upheaval when entire court systems were destroyed and their entertainment traditions threatened with complete extinction. The resistance movement's archives often contained the only surviving records of regional humor styles, satirical techniques, and performance innovations that had been developed by generations of entertainers who were subsequently executed or forced into hiding by changing political circumstances. The preservation of these cultural traditions ensured that later generations would have access to the artistic and intellectual innovations developed by medieval entertainers. The influence of preserved Gesture traditions can be directly traced to the development of later European theatre, particularly in the evolution of commedia dell'arte, puppet shows like Punch and Judy, and early forms of political satire that emerged during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. Many of the character types, plot structures, and comedic techniques that became standard elements of European theatrical tradition had their origins in medieval Gesture performances that were preserved and transmitted through resistance network archives and underground cultural preservation efforts. The survival of these traditions demonstrates the enduring value of the cultural preservation work undertaken by resistance movements. The resistance movement's emphasis on political commentary disguised as entertainment also contributed significantly to the development of satirical literature and underground political writing that would flourish during later periods of European history when direct political criticism was dangerous or impossible. The truth-poison techniques developed by medieval jesters, which involved delivering serious criticism disguised as harmless entertainment, became standard approaches used by later writers, pamphleteers, and political commentators working under oppressive political conditions throughout European and world history. These techniques for delivering political criticism through entertainment would become central to democratic discourse and social criticism. The sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques pioneered by medieval jesters in their survival efforts also contributed to significant advances in understanding human behavior and social psychology that would influence later developments in these fields. The detailed methods developed for reading human emotions, predicting behavioral patterns, and influencing group dynamics through entertainment provided insights that would eventually contribute to the development of modern psychology, advertising techniques, and political communication strategies. The psychological insights developed by medieval jesters would prove remarkably prescient and relevant to modern understanding of human behavior and social dynamics. The international communication systems developed by gesture resistance networks contributed to substantial improvements in information transmission and cultural exchange throughout medieval and early modern Europe. The movement's necessity for coordinating activities across national boundaries led to innovations in coded communication, secure message transmission, and cultural translation that facilitated broader European integration and intellectual development during crucial periods of cultural and political transformation. These communication innovations would influence the development of later diplomatic and cultural exchange systems. The resistance movement's comprehensive documentation of royal psychological profiles and court political dynamics also provided invaluable historical records that have contributed significantly to modern understanding of medieval political culture and social structures. These detailed accounts of royal behavior, court intrigue, and social dynamics offer perspectives on medieval life that are completely unavailable in official court records or contemporary chronicles, providing historians with unique insights into the actual functioning of medieval political systems. Without these resistance records, much of our understanding of medieval court life and political culture would be incomplete or inaccurate. The influence of medieval gesture resistance principles on later revolutionary and reform movements throughout European history demonstrates the enduring power of the organizational and ideological innovations developed by these early human rights activists. The fundamental concepts pioneered by the gesture underground, including the principles of collective action, international solidarity, systematic documentation of abuse, and protection of vulnerable workers, would reappear consistently in numerous later movements dedicated to challenging oppressive authority and protecting vulnerable populations. These principles would become central to democratic and human rights movements worldwide. The Protestant Reformation drew extensively on gesture resistance traditions, particularly in its innovative use of satirical entertainment and coded communication to spread revolutionary religious ideas while avoiding detection by Catholic authorities. Many Protestant reformers explicitly adopted gesture techniques for disguising serious religious criticism as harmless entertainment, allowing them to reach broader audiences while reducing their risk of persecution by established religious authorities who were actively hunting heretics and religious dissidents. The use of humor and entertainment to spread revolutionary ideas became a standard technique for religious and political reformers throughout European history. The English Civil War and other 17th century revolutionary movements incorporated organizational strategies and communication methods that showed clear descent from gesture resistance networks. The underground coordination systems, international support networks, and propaganda techniques used by parliamentary forces against Charles I demonstrated obvious influences from the resistance methods developed by medieval gesture organizations over previous centuries. The ability to coordinate revolutionary activities across vast geographical areas while maintaining security against hostile authorities reflected organizational innovations pioneered by gesture resistance movements. The 18th century Enlightenment drew extensively on the intellectual traditions preserved and developed by gesture resistance movements, particularly the emphasis on using reason and wit to challenge arbitrary authority and their sophisticated techniques for delivering serious criticism through entertainment. Many Enlightenment philosophers explicitly referenced gesture traditions in their critiques of absolute monarchy and their arguments for individual rights and democratic governance. The Enlightenment emphasis on rational criticism of authority and the use of wit and irony to expose political absurdity showed clear connections to gesture resistance traditions. The French Revolution incorporated numerous organizational and ideological elements directly derived from gesture resistance traditions, including the use of satirical entertainment for political mobilization and the principle that systematic oppression justified revolutionary violence against established authority. The revolutionary concept of liberté, égalité, fraternité reflected fundamental principles that had been developed and refined through centuries of gesture resistance activity. The use of public performance and entertainment to mobilize popular support for revolutionary change showed clear influence from gesture resistance techniques. The 19th century labor movement drew directly on gesture resistance precedents in developing strategies for worker organization and collective action against employer abuse. The principle that workers possessed inherent dignity that could not be legitimately violated by employers, regardless of their power or status, represented a direct continuation of concepts pioneered by medieval gesture resistance movements. The labor movement's emphasis on international solidarity, collective action, and systematic documentation of workplace abuse reflected organizational approaches developed centuries earlier by gesture resistance networks. The development of international humanitarian law during the 19th and 20th centuries reflected principles and practices that had been pioneered by Gesta resistance networks centuries earlier. The concept of universal human rights that transcended national boundaries and political allegiances had its historical roots in the international solidarity principles developed by medieval entertainer protection organizations. The modern system of international humanitarian assistance and human rights monitoring shows clear conceptual connections to the approaches pioneered by Gesta resistance movements. Modern human rights organizations, including groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, use documentation strategies, international coordination methods, and victim support systems that show clear conceptual connections to the approaches pioneered by medieval Gesta resistance movements. The fundamental techniques for exposing systematic abuse, coordinating international pressure campaigns, and providing support for victims of oppression remain remarkably consistent across centuries of human rights advocacy. The organizational methods developed by Gesta resistance networks continue to influence modern humanitarian work. The evolution of medieval court gestas into modern forms of political commentary and social criticism demonstrates the enduring power of the entertainment traditions preserved and developed by resistance movements throughout the dangerous centuries when these entertainers faced systematic persecution and execution. The transformation of the Gesta role from dangerous court entertainer to protected public social critic reflects broader changes in European political culture while maintaining fundamental connections to the resistance traditions that had protected medieval entertainers. The survival of Gesta traditions through centuries of persecution demonstrates their fundamental importance to human societies. The development of professional journalism and political commentary during the 18th and 19th centuries drew heavily on Gesta traditions of using wit and humor to deliver serious criticism of political authority. Many early newspaper columnists and political satirists explicitly modeled their work on Gesta techniques for disguising pointed criticism as entertaining commentary, allowing them to reach broader audiences while reducing their vulnerability to government censorship and legal retaliation. A modern tradition of satirical political commentary shows clear descent from medieval Gesta techniques preserved through resistance networks. The emergence of editorial cartoons and political satire as standard features of modern democratic discourse reflects the direct influence of Gesta entertainment traditions that had been preserved and transmitted through resistance networks during the dangerous medieval period. The use of visual humor, exaggeration, and symbolic representation to comment on political development shows clear connections to medieval Gesta performance techniques that had been maintained through underground cultural preservation efforts. Modern political satire continues many of the specific techniques developed by medieval jesters. Modern stand-up comedy and satirical television programming continue many of the traditions pioneered by medieval court jesters, including the fundamental concept of speaking truth to power through entertainment and the use of humor to comment on political developments and social issues. Comedians like Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, and John Oliver explicitly reference Gesta traditions in their approach to political commentary, acknowledging their debt to the medieval entertainers who pioneered these techniques under far more dangerous circumstances. The continuing popularity of satirical entertainment demonstrates the enduring appeal of Gesta techniques. The concept of Gesta's privilege, which allowed medieval entertainers to criticize authority figures without facing immediate punishment, has evolved into modern concepts of press freedom and artistic expression that remain central to democratic governance. The principle that entertainers and commentators should be protected from government retaliation for their criticism represents a direct continuation of medieval Gesta traditions, expanded and formalized through centuries of political development. Modern democratic societies continue to grapple with balancing free expression with political stability, or reflecting the same tensions that characterize medieval Gesta-monarch relationships. The development of underground and alternative media during periods of political oppression shows clear influences from Gesta resistance communication strategies developed during the medieval period. Dissident movements in Nazi Germany, Soviet Eastern Europe, and other oppressive political systems used entertainment and humor to spread critical information while averting detection, following patterns that had been established by medieval Gesta resistance networks. The use of coded humor and satirical commentary to communicate dangerous political ideas remains a standard technique for dissidents worldwide. Modern social media and internet communication have created new opportunities for the kinds of political commentary and social criticism that were pioneered by medieval jesters and preserved through their resistance networks. The ability to reach large audiences with satirical content while maintaining some degree of anonymity reflects technological evolution of communication strategies that were first developed by gesture resistance movement centuries earlier. The democratization of satirical commentary through digital technology continues the gesture tradition of using humor to challenge authority and expose social problems. The continuing relevance of gesture traditions in modern political discourse demonstrates the enduring value of the principles and techniques developed by medieval resistance movements to protect entertainers and preserve their cultural contributions. The survival of these traditions through centuries of political upheaval and technological change testifies to their fundamental importance in human societies and their continuing relevance for modern democratic discourse. The gesture tradition remains one of the most important contributions of medieval culture to modern democratic society. The organizational innovations developed by medieval gesture resistance networks continue to provide valuable models for modern social movements, humanitarian organizations, and human rights advocacy groups working to protect vulnerable populations and challenge systematic oppression throughout the world. The sophisticated coordination methods, security procedures, and resource management techniques pioneered by these early activists have influenced the development of modern organizational strategies for social change and humanitarian assistance in ways that are often unrecognized but remain fundamentally important. The resistance movement's emphasis on creating alternative economic systems and support networks for people who could not rely on official institutions remains highly relevant for modern organizations working with marginalized communities. The development of parallel economic structures, underground resource distribution networks, and alternative employment systems provides important models for contemporary efforts to support vulnerable populations who face systematic exclusion from mainstream economic opportunities. Modern organizations working with refugees, domestic violence survivors, and other vulnerable populations continue to use similar approaches. The international coordination methods developed by gesture resistance networks have significantly influenced the evolution of modern transnational advocacy networks and global civil society organizations. The ability to coordinate activities across national boundaries, share resources between different regional organizations, and maintain communication networks despite hostile political conditions remains essential for contemporary human rights work and international humanitarian assistance. The globalization of human rights advocacy reflects organizational innovations pioneered by gesture resistance movement. The security procedures and operational security methods pioneered by the gesture underground continue to be highly relevant for modern organizations working under hostile political conditions around the world. The use of coded communications, compartmentalized organizational structures, and secure resource movement techniques remains necessary for human rights organizations operating in oppressive political environments where discovery could result in imprisonment, torture, or death. Modern human rights organizations continue to adapt security techniques developed centuries earlier by gesture resistance networks. The resistance movement's systematic approach to cultural preservation and historical documentation provides important models for contemporary efforts to preserve endangered cultures and document systematic human rights violations. The systematic collection of testimonies, preservation of cultural traditions, and maintenance of historical archives continues to be essential for protecting cultural diversity and preventing historical denial in modern human rights advocacy. The importance of cultural preservation as a form of resistance against oppression remains as relevant today as it was during the medieval period. The psychological support systems developed by gesture resistance networks have significantly influenced modern approaches to trauma therapy, peer support, and victim assistance programs. The recognition that systematic oppression causes lasting psychological damage and that recovery requires specialized treatment within supportive communities remains fundamental to contemporary victim assistance programs and trauma therapy approaches worldwide. The group therapy techniques and peer support methods pioneered by gesture resistance medical networks continue to influence modern therapeutic practice. The resistance movement's emphasis on maintaining human dignity and individual worth even under extreme oppression continues to inspire modern human rights advocacy and social justice movements around the world. The principle that every person possesses inherent value that cannot be legitimately violated by authority figures remains central to contemporary struggles against systematic oppression and human rights violations. The moral courage demonstrated by gesture resistance fighters continues to inspire modern human rights advocates. The courage, creativity, and dedication demonstrated by medieval jester resistance fighters provide continuing inspiration for modern activists working to challenge injustice and protect vulnerable populations. Their example demonstrates that even under conditions of extreme danger and apparent powerlessness, individuals working together can make meaningful contributions to protecting human rights and advancing social justice. The legacy of jester resistance movement reminds modern activists that effective resistance is possible even under the most oppressive conditions. The forgotten heroes of the medieval jester resistance movement represent some of the earliest and most courageous human rights activists in European history, individuals whose names and stories have been largely erased from official historical records, but whose contributions to the development of human dignity concepts deserve recognition and remembrance. These brave men and women risked everything to protect vulnerable entertainers from systematic abuse and to challenge the arbitrary authority of absolute monarchs who treated human beings as expendable sources of entertainment. The underground medical practitioners who staffed secret treatment facilities for tortured and traumatized jesters demonstrated extraordinary courage and compassion in providing care for victims of royal sadism. These physicians, surgeons, and herbalists who had been expelled from official practice continued to use their healing skills to treat the most vulnerable members of medieval society, often at enormous personal risk and with no prospect of recognition, financial reward, or social advancement. Their commitment to healing regardless of personal cost represents one of the highest expressions of medical ethics and humanitarian commitment. The resistance chroniclers who maintained detailed records of royal atrocities and jester suffering performed crucial historical documentation work that has contributed significantly to modern understanding of medieval court life and political culture. These secretive historians, working under constant threat of discovery and execution, preserved testimonies and accounts that would otherwise have been completely lost to historical memory, ensuring that the stories of abuse and resistance would survive for future generations. Their dedication to historical truth despite enormous personal danger represents the highest ideals of scholarly integrity and moral courage. The safe house operators and transportation coordinators who provided escape routes for endangered jesters demonstrated remarkable organizational skills and personal courage in maintaining networks that stretched across medieval Europe. These individuals, often ordinary merchants, craftspeople, and religious figures, risked their own safety and that of their families to provide sanctuary for entertainers fleeing from dangerous court positions. Their willingness to endanger themselves for strangers demonstrates extraordinary moral courage and commitment to human solidarity. The financial supporters and resource providers who funded resistance activities represented a diverse group of wealthy merchants, progressive religious leaders, and sympathetic nobles who understood that protecting jesters was part of a broader struggle against arbitrary authority and systematic oppression. Their willingness to risk their economic interests and political positions to support humanitarian activities demonstrated remarkable moral courage and commitment to human dignity. Their financial support made possible the extensive network of safe houses, medical facilities, and escape routes that saved countless lives. The deep-cover jester agents who maintained their entertainment personas while secretly gathering intelligence and coordinating resistance activities faced perhaps the greatest dangers of all resistance participants. These individuals lived double lives for years or even decades, constantly balancing their survival need against their commitment to protecting other entertainers from abuse, torture, and execution. Their psychological resilience and moral commitment allowed them to function effectively in the most dangerous possible circumstances while maintaining their dedication to protecting others. The escaped jesters who joined resistance networks and dedicated their lives to helping other entertainers avoid similar fate showed extraordinary resilience and dedication to collective welfare over personal safety. Many of these individuals could have used their freedom to pursue safer, more comfortable lives, but instead chose to continue fighting against the system that had traumatized them, using their experiences to protect others from similar suffering. Their commitment to using their own trauma as a tool for helping others represents remarkable psychological strength and moral courage. The memory of these forgotten heroes deserves preservation and honor as part of the broader history of human rights development and the struggle against systematic oppression throughout human history. Their courage, compassion, and moral commitment established precedents for humanitarian action that continue to inspire modern human rights advocates and provide guidance for contemporary efforts to protect vulnerable populations from systematic abuse and oppression. The modern lessons that can be learned from the medieval gesture resistance movement remain remarkably relevant to contemporary struggles against systematic oppression, workplace abuse, and the violation of human dignity in various forms around the world. The strategies, principles, and organizational methods developed by these early human rights activists provide valuable guidance for modern movements working to protect vulnerable populations and challenge arbitrary authority in the 21st century. The enduring relevance of these lessons demonstrates the universal nature of the struggle for human dignity and the continuing importance of resistance to systematic oppression. The importance of systematic documentation and record-keeping demonstrated by gesture resistance chroniclers remains crucial for modern human rights work. The systematic collection and preservation of testimony from abuse victims, detailed accounts of systematic oppression, and comprehensive records of official crimes continue to be central tools for exposing injustice and holding powerful actors accountable for their actions in contemporary human rights advocacy. The digital age has made documentation easier but also more dangerous, as electronic records can be more easily discovered by hostile authorities. The international solidarity and cross-border cooperation pioneered by gesture resistance networks provide important models for modern humanitarian organizations working to protect vulnerable populations across national boundaries. The principle that people have moral obligations to protect others from systematic abuse regardless of nationality, religion, or political affiliation remains central to international human rights law and humanitarian assistance efforts worldwide. The globalization of human rights advocacy reflects the international solidarity principles pioneered by gesture resistance movements. The underground economic networks developed by the gesture resistance demonstrate the continuing importance of alternative support systems for protecting people who cannot rely on official institutions for assistance. Modern organizations working with political refugees, domestic violence victims, and other vulnerable populations continue to use similar approaches for providing financial support, safe housing, and transportation assistance when official systems fail or prove inadequate. The development of alternative economic structures remains essential for protecting vulnerable populations. The psychological support and trauma treatment methods pioneered by gesture resistance medical networks provide insights that remain highly relevant for modern victim assistance programs. The recognition that systematic abuse causes lasting psychological damage and that recovery requires specialized treatment and ongoing peer support within understanding communities continues to be fundamental to modern approaches to trauma therapy and victim assistance programs. The group therapy and peer support methods developed by medieval resistance networks continue to influence modern therapeutic practice. The communication and security methods developed by the gesture underground remain relevant for modern organizations working under hostile political conditions around the world. The use of coded communications, secure transportation routes, and hidden resource networks continues to be necessary for human rights organizations working in oppressive political environments where discovery could result in imprisonment, torture, or death. Modern technology has created new opportunities for secure communication, but also new vulnerabilities that require constant adaptation of security methods. The resistance movement's emphasis on preserving cultural traditions and maintaining human dignity even under extreme oppression provides inspiration for modern movements working to protect minority cultures and individual rights against systematic persecution. The principle that every person possesses inherent worth that cannot be legitimately violated by authority figures remains central to human rights advocacy worldwide. The cultural preservation work undertaken by resistance movements demonstrates the importance of maintaining human identity and dignity even under the most oppressive conditions. The courage and dedication demonstrated by medieval gesture resistance fighters provide important models for modern activists working to challenge systematic oppression and protect vulnerable populations around the world. Their example demonstrates that effective resistance is possible even under conditions of extreme danger and apparent powerlessness, and that individuals working together can make meaningful contributions to protecting human rights and advancing social justice. The ultimate legacy of the medieval court gesture resistance movement lies not only in its immediate contributions to protecting vulnerable entertainers, but in its fundamental challenge to the concept of absolute authority and its pioneering role in developing principles that would eventually evolve into modern human rights concepts and international humanitarian law. These brave individuals, working under conditions of extreme danger and with minimal resources, establish precedents and principles that continue to influence contemporary struggles for human dignity and social justice around the world. The resistance movement's core principle that no person, regardless of their social status or profession, could be legitimately subjected to systematic abuse or arbitrary violence represented a revolutionary challenge to medieval concepts of authority and social hierarchy. This fundamental insight would eventually contribute to the development of universal human rights principles that recognize the inherent dignity of all human beings regardless of their position in social or political hierarchies. The principle of universal human dignity pioneered by gender resistance movements remains central to modern human rights advocacy. The international solidarity demonstrated by gender resistance networks, which provided assistance to endangered entertainers regardless of their nationality or political allegiance, established important precedents for modern concepts of humanitarian assistance and universal human rights obligations. The principle that people have moral responsibilities to protect others from systematic oppression, even when those others belong to different communities or nations, remains central to contemporary human rights law and international humanitarian assistance. The sophisticated documentation and historical preservation efforts undertaken by resistance chroniclers contributed significantly to the development of modern approaches to historical accountability and transitional justice. The systematic recording of testimonies from abuse victims and detailed documentation of official crimes provided important models for contemporary truth and reconciliation processes and international criminal justice procedures. The importance of historical documentation for preventing denial and ensuring accountability remains central to modern human rights work. The organizational innovations developed by the resistance movement, including underground communication networks, resource distribution systems, and security procedures, influenced the evolution of modern social movements and humanitarian organizations working to protect vulnerable populations and challenge systematic oppression. The methods developed for coordinating activities across vast geographical areas while maintaining security against hostile authorities continue to provide guidance for contemporary advocacy organizations and social change movements. The cultural preservation activities undertaken by resistance networks ensured the survival of entertainment traditions, humor styles, and social criticism techniques that continue to influence modern democratic discourse and artistic expression. The preservation of gender performance traditions contributed significantly to the development of modern satirical entertainment, political commentary, and social criticism that remain essential elements of democratic society worldwide. The cultural legacy of gender resistance movements continues to enrich human civilization. The psychological insights developed through resistance support programs for traumatized jesters contributed to early advances in understanding mental health and trauma therapy that influenced the development of modern victim assistance and psychological treatment approaches. The recognition that systematic abuse causes lasting psychological damage and that recovery requires specialized treatment within supportive communities remains fundamental to contemporary approaches to trauma therapy and victim assistance programs. The economic innovations developed by resistance networks, including alternative employment systems and resource distribution mechanisms, provided important models for modern approaches to supporting marginalized communities and protecting vulnerable workers from exploitation and abuse. The development of parallel economic structures and mutual aid systems continues to be relevant for contemporary efforts to support communities that face systematic exclusion from mainstream economic opportunities. Perhaps most importantly, the courage, creativity, and moral commitment demonstrated by medieval gender resistance fighters provide continuing inspiration for modern movements working to protect human dignity and challenge systematic oppression throughout the world. Their example demonstrates that even under conditions of extreme danger and apparent powerlessness, individuals working together can make meaningful contributions to protecting vulnerable populations and advancing human rights principles. The medieval court gender resistance movement ultimately represents one of humanity's earliest organized efforts to establish the principle that every person possesses inherent dignity that cannot be legitimately violated by authority figures, regardless of their power or status. This principle, forged in the underground networks and secret safe houses of medieval Europe, continues to inspire and guide contemporary struggles for human rights, social justice, and the protection of vulnerable populations around the world. The forgotten heroes of the gender resistance movement deserve recognition not only for their immediate contributions to protecting medieval entertainers, but for their pioneering role in developing concepts and strategies that continue to influence modern human rights advocacy. Their legacy reminds us that the struggle for human dignity has ancient roots and that contemporary human rights movements build upon foundations laid by countless unnamed individuals who risked everything to protect others from systematic cruelty and oppression. Their courage in enduring unendurable conditions, their determination to protect their families despite impossible odds, and their ability to find moments of joy and connection in the midst of suffering, testify to the strength of the human spirit and remind us of our shared humanity. So the next time you see a medieval castle, whether in person or in pictures, remember the untold thousands who lived within its walls not as lords and ladies, but as servants and workers, gods and craftsmen, women and children whose lives were shaped by suffering but who remained fundamentally human despite the system's attempts to dehumanize them. Their stories matter because they remind us that history is not just about great events and famous people, but about the daily experiences of ordinary people who deserve to be remembered, honored, and never forgotten. Remember them, because in remembering them, we honor the best of our own humanity and commit ourselves to building a world where no one will have to endure what they endured just to survive. Thank you for joining us on this dark journey through medieval castle life. Until next time, this has been another episode of Lazy History, where we uncover the truths that textbooks prefer to forget.